Hello everyone. Welcome to Mr. Midnight True Crime Stories. I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep. So before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. Before we begin tonight, please take a moment to settle in. Dim your lights if you haven't already. Pull your blanket a little closer. Rest your head on your pillow and let your shoulders fall. Let the tension of your day begin to soften. You are safe here. You are home. And tonight, we are going to travel together, gently, carefully, thoughtfully, back through time. Back to a California that no longer exists. Back to the dusty train depots and gaslit hotel corridors of 1906. Back to a story that, once it broke across the front pages of newspapers from San Francisco to Sacramento, would change the way the entire state of California thought about women, about marriage, about love, and about the terrifying lengths a person might go to protect a secret they cannot afford to have discovered. This is a true story, and because it is true, we approach it with respect. The people in this story were real. They breathed real air. They felt real love and real fear. They made choices, some ordinary, some devastating, and those choices rippled outward in ways none of them could have predicted. We tell this story not for shock, not for spectacle, and not to reduce anyone to a headline. We tell it to remember, to reflect, to understand, as best we can, the fragile and sometimes terrifying complexity of the human heart. If at any point during the night this story feels too heavy, please feel free to let your mind drift. Let the sound of the narration become a gentle current, carrying you towards sleep. That is exactly what this space is for. Now, let us begin. The year was 1906. California in that era was a place caught between two worlds, part frontier, part civilization, still figuring out what it wanted to be. The gold rush had come and gone, but it had left behind an entire culture, restless, ambitious, mobile, and full of people who had traveled great distances in search of something better. Women in that world occupied a particular kind of tension. On paper, they were expected to be wives and mothers, gentle keepers of domestic order. In practice, especially in the rougher, more transient corners of California, women were often on their own, often surviving, often navigating a world that offered them very little protection and even less forgiveness. Into that world, a woman named Emma Ledoux had carved out a life. Or perhaps more accurately, she had carved out several lives, one after another, layered on top of each other like the pages of a book that no one was supposed to read all the way through. She was, by the time her name became known across California, a woman who had been married multiple times, who had moved across state lines, who had worked in establishments that respectable society preferred not to name, and who had accumulated both admirers and enemies in roughly equal measure. She was not a monster. That is the first thing to understand about Emma Ledoux, even before we know what she did. She was a human being, complicated, flawed, shaped by circumstances and choices and a world that had not been particularly kind to women like her. But she was also dangerous. And in the spring of 1906, the danger that lived somewhere inside her would come fully to the surface in a way that California would not forget for generations. The story, as it entered the public consciousness, began with a trunk. It was the kind of heavy, wooden-slatted trunk that people used in those days to ship belongings across the country. Durable, deep, the sort of thing a family might pack full of their entire lives when they were moving west. This particular trunk arrived at the Stockton Railroad Depot on a cool March morning, brought in by a hired man and set down in the baggage room with a soft, heavy thud. There was nothing immediately unusual about it. Trunks passed through that depot every single day. They came and went with the trains, bound for every corner of the country. But this trunk did not have a baggage tag. That small detail, the absence of a single paper tag, was the thread that would unravel everything. Because without a tag, the trunk could not be loaded onto a train. Without a tag, there was no destination. Without a tag, the trunk simply sat. Hour after hour, it sat in the baggage room of the Stockton Depot while workers moved around it, while trains came and went, while the ordinary business of a working Thursday proceeded around it in all its ordinary noise and motion. And as the morning stretched into afternoon, and the afternoon stretched toward evening, the workers in that baggage room began to notice something. A smell. It was faint at first. The kind of thing you tell yourself is nothing. A dead animal somewhere nearby, maybe. The river. The summer heat getting to something that had been left out too long. But as the hours passed, the smell grew stronger. It became impossible to ignore. And then one of the workers, in the course of moving the trunk to a different corner of the room, felt something shift inside it. Not a shift the way clothing shifts, or books, or household goods. A shift the way something heavy shifts. Something with weight and presence. Something that, when the trunk was tilted, moved against the inside of the lid with a dull, wet sound that none of the workers could easily explain and none of them could easily forget. One of the men placed his hand flat against the side of the trunk and held it there for a moment. Then he straightened up and looked at the other workers and said, and these are not his exact words, but they are close enough, someone needs to get the police. The Stockton police arrived within the hour. The depot was quiet by then, the last trains of the evening having already departed, and the baggage room was lit by oil lamps that threw long, uncertain shadows across the walls and floor. The officers approached the trunk carefully. One of them crouched down and placed his face close to the seam of the lid, and whatever he smelled in that moment confirmed everything the workers had already suspected. The lock was broken, the lid was lifted, and inside, folded into the trunk in a way that suggested haste rather than care, was the body of a man. He was fully clothed. He appeared to be in his 30s or 40s. His face was slack and still, the color that a face becomes when life has left it entirely. And in the close, heated air of that baggage room, with the smell of death filling every corner, the officers stood very still for a moment, the way people do when they encounter something that the ordinary mind is not prepared to process. One of the officers reached for his notebook. Another stepped outside to be sick. A third remained crouched beside the trunk, studying the body with the careful, professional attention of a man who has learned to put his feelings somewhere else when the work requires it. The victim, they would determine within the next several hours, was a man named Albert McVicker. He was approximately 40 years old. He had been, as best the initial examination could determine, poisoned. His body showed no obvious signs of a struggle, no broken bones, no deep wounds. But there was something in the stillness of him, in the particular relaxation of his features, that spoke to a death that had not been quick or peaceful. He had not simply gone to sleep and not woken up. He had been given something, and that something had taken him apart slowly from the inside, in the darkness of a room somewhere in this city, before his body had been folded into this trunk and brought here to be shipped away like furniture. And the last person known to have seen Albert McVicker alive was his wife. Her name, at the time of the discovery, was listed on the hotel register where the two of them had been staying together. She had signed them in as Mr. and Mrs. McVicker. She had been seen in the lobby. She had been seen in the hotel corridor. She had spoken to the doctor who had been called when McVicker fell ill the day before. She had spoken to the clerk at the front desk. She had, by all accounts, behaved normally, calmly, like a woman who had nothing to hide. And then she had vanished. Her name was Emma Ledoux. And by the time the police in Stockton began to understand the full dimensions of what they were dealing with, Emma Ledoux was already miles away, moving through the California night with the practiced ease of a woman who had learned, over the course of a long and complicated life, exactly how to disappear. But here is the thing about disappearing in 1906. It was harder than it sounds. The telegraph lines that ran alongside the railroad tracks were, in their own way, faster than any person traveling by train. The moment the Stockton police identified their suspect and sent her description and known aliases out across the wire, every depot, every hotel desk, every sheriff's office from San Francisco to the Oregon border had Emma Ledoux's name. The net was already closing before she even knew it had been cast. What Emma did not know, what she could not have known, sitting in whatever room she had retreated to after leaving Stockton, was that the trunk she had so carefully prepared, the trunk she had purchased and packed and hired a man to transport to the depot, the trunk she believed would carry Albert McVicker's body out of her life forever, had never left the ground. It had sat in the baggage room all day. It had been found. It had been opened. And now, in the lamplit offices of the Stockton Police Department, the officers who were piecing together the story of what had happened in that hotel room were beginning to understand that what they were looking at was not a crime of passion or a moment of terrible impulse. They were looking at something far more deliberate. They were looking at a plan. And the woman at the center of that plan had been building it, piece by careful piece, for longer than anyone yet realized. Because Emma LeDoux's story did not begin in Stockton. It did not begin with Albert McVicker. It did not begin with the hotel, or the whiskey, or the morphine, or the trunk. It began much earlier, in a quieter corner of California, in a family that had no particular reason to believe the child they were raising would one day become the most talked about woman in the state. It began, as most stories do, with a girl who simply wanted something more. And in a world that offered women like Emma very few honest paths to something more, the road she eventually chose was one that wound through marriages and secrets and borrowed names and buried pasts, until it arrived, finally and inevitably, at a heavy trunk in a railroad depot, and a smell that no one in the baggage room would ever be able to forget. Tonight, we are going to follow that road. All of it. From the beginning. We are going to sit with Emma LeDoux, not to excuse her, not to condemn her, but to understand her. To understand the world she moved through and the choices she made within it. To remember Albert McVicker, who deserves to be known as a man, not simply as a body in a trunk. And to think, quietly, about all the ways a life can go wrong, slowly, gradually, one small decision at a time, until you find yourself somewhere you never imagined you would be, and the only way forward is a road you should never have started down. Close your eyes if you like. Let the words carry you. We are going back to the beginning now. We are going back to California, in the years before the earthquake, before the century had fully found its footing, when the state was still young and still restless and full of people who believed, with varying degrees of justification, that they were capable of reinventing themselves entirely. Emma Teresa Cole was born in 1875 in Amador County, California. She was the daughter of parents who were, by the standards of the time and place, reasonably comfortable. Amador County in those years was gold rush country, though the Great Rush itself had largely subsided by the time Emma was born. What remained was a landscape shaped by that frantic, transformative era. Small towns carved out of hillsides, communities built around the mining industry, families who had come from every corner of the country and the world in search of gold, and stayed when the gold ran out, because they had built lives there, because the land was beautiful, because there was nowhere else left to go. Emma grew up in this world. She attended school. She learned to read and write. She learned the domestic arts that women of her generation were expected to master: sewing, cooking, the management of a household. She was, by the accounts that survive, an attractive young woman. Dark-haired, sharp-eyed, quick in her movements and her speech. The kind of woman who commanded attention when she entered a room, not because she tried to, but because there was something in her presence, something alert and watchful and slightly charged, that made people notice her. She also had, from a very early age, a quality that the people around her could not quite name but could definitely feel. It was something like determination, something like will, a sense that Emma Cole had looked at the life available to her in Amador County, California, in the 1880s and 1890s, and had decided, quietly and thoroughly, that it was not enough. She wanted more. She did not know exactly what more looked like, but she knew it was out there, somewhere beyond the hills of Amador County, somewhere down the road and across the mountains and into whatever version of the future was being assembled in the cities and towns of a rapidly changing America. The question, and it is a question that will follow us through this entire story, is what she was willing to do to find it. Her first marriage came early. She was a young woman, barely past girlhood, when she married for the first time. The husband's name has been recorded as Barrett, and very little else about him survives in the historical record. What does survive is the fact that the marriage was brief, and that it ended. Whether it ended in divorce or in some other way is not entirely clear from the sources that remain. What is clear is that Emma emerged from it alone, and that being alone, at her age, in that era, in that world, was both a freedom and a precarity that she would spend the rest of her life trying to manage. She was, by then, no longer simply Emma Cole. She was someone who had already lived more than one version of a life. Someone who had already learned that the person you are on paper and the person you are in practice do not always have to be the same person. That lesson, learned early, absorbed deeply, would prove to be the central organizing principle of everything that followed. And somewhere in the years that followed her first marriage, Emma began moving. She began the pattern of travel and relocation that would define the rest of her life. She moved through California. She crossed into Arizona. She remade herself, name by name and town by town, into whatever version of Emma was most useful in any given moment. And somewhere along the way, she met a man named William Williams. And that is where the story begins to take a turn that none of the people around Emma could have anticipated. Because William Williams, in the quiet calculus of Emma's increasingly complicated life, would not simply be a husband. He would be a dry run. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Let your breathing slow. Let your body sink deeper into wherever you are resting tonight. We have only just begun. William Williams was, by most accounts, an ordinary man. Not remarkable in any particular way that the surviving records can illuminate. Not wealthy, not famous, not the kind of person whose name would have appeared in a newspaper under ordinary circumstances. He was simply a man who, at some point in the early 1890s, encountered Emma Cole and found himself drawn to her in the way that men frequently found themselves drawn to Emma. Quickly, completely, and with a certainty that he likely could not have explained if asked to. They married and settled in Arizona. The details of their life together are sparse. We know they moved, as Emma seemed always to move, restlessly and without a great deal of apparent attachment to any particular place. We know they lived in one of those small Arizona towns that existed in that era primarily as a service station for the mining and ranching industries. Dusty, transient, full of people passing through, and a smaller population of people who had decided to stay. We know that Emma was, by this point in her life, a woman who had already learned to present multiple faces to the world, and that the face she showed William Williams was the face he needed to see in order to stay with her. And then William Williams died. He became ill. He was treated. He did not recover. He died in the way that people died in that era from 100 different causes, some of them mundane and some of them anything but. The medical records, if they were ever kept with any rigor, do not survive. The death was recorded. The grief, if there was grief, was not recorded at all, because grief in that era was considered a private matter, something you carried inside yourself, and did not display publicly unless you were a woman of sufficient social standing to make your mourning into a statement. Emma was not that kind of woman. What Emma did, in the weeks and months following William Williams' death, was collect on his life insurance policy. This fact, the life insurance, the payout, the quiet financial transaction that occurred in the aftermath of her husband's death, would later become one of the most discussed and debated elements of Emma's story. Because taken in isolation, a widow collecting on her husband's life insurance is not suspicious. It is simply what you do. It is the entire reason life insurance exists. But taken in the context of everything that would later be discovered about Emma Ledoux, the pattern that would emerge, clear and disturbing, from the wreckage of her subsequent relationships, the insurance money on William Williams began to look like something else entirely. It began to look like a preview. But in the moment, in those dusty Arizona weeks after Williams' death, no one was looking at Emma with suspicion. They were looking at her with condolence. She was a widow. She was young. She had her insurance money and her freedom and a whole world of possible next steps laid out in front of her, and the people around her, if they thought about her at all, probably assumed she would remarry quickly, as was expected, and move on. They were right about the remarrying quickly part. What they could not have anticipated was what would happen next. Emma's third marriage, though calling it a marriage in any simple sense understates its complexity, was to a man named Albert N. McVicker. He was, by all accounts, a man of some substance and steadiness. Not wealthy, but working. Not famous, but known. He had a job, a reputation, a sense of himself as someone who was building a life through honest effort. He was, in other words, exactly the kind of man who might trust a woman completely, because he himself was trustworthy, and he had not yet learned that trustworthiness in yourself does not protect you from untrustworthy in others. Albert McVicker fell in love with Emma. This is perhaps the most important thing to understand about him, and about the tragedy that would eventually unfold. He loved her, genuinely, deeply, in the way that men love women they believe they understand. He believed he knew who Emma was. He believed he understood her moods and her silences and the restlessness that lived in her eyes. He believed, as many people believe about the people they love, that whatever difficult parts of Emma existed, and he was not entirely blind to them, he could manage those parts, could steady her, could be the anchor that kept her from drifting too far. He was wrong about that, but the wrongness was sincere, and the sincerity, in its own way, is what makes his story so heartbreaking. They married in 1902 in Arizona. The wedding, if there was a ceremony, is not described in any detail in the records that survive. What survives is the marriage certificate, the date, the names. Albert McVicker and Emma Williams, for she had taken Williams' name, became husband and wife. And for a time, they lived together. In Arizona, in the way that people lived in Arizona in those years, working, managing, getting through the days. Albert believed he was building something. He believed he and Emma were constructing a future together, one ordinary day at a time, in the way that married people do. But Emma was not building a future with Albert McVicker. Emma was watching Albert McVicker the way a person watches a door they are not sure they want to walk through. The marriage deteriorated. The precise causes are not documented. Marriages that fail in private tend to leave very few records of their unraveling. What we know is that at some point, the couple separated. Emma left. She moved on, in the way she always moved on, with speed and decisiveness and very little backward glancing. She took herself and whatever was useful to her from the life she and Albert had shared, and she disappeared into the broader geography of California and the West. Albert, for his part, did not pursue a divorce. This was not uncommon in that era. Divorce was expensive, complicated, socially stigmatizing, and legally cumbersome. Many couples who separated simply left it there. They drifted apart and allowed the practical reality of their separation to substitute for the legal formality of a divorce. They told themselves they would deal with it eventually, that there was no urgency, that the marriage existed on paper but not in practice, and that the paper, without the practice, meant very little. For Albert McVicker, that assumption would prove to be catastrophic. Because while Albert was going about his life in the months and years following his separation from Emma, working, surviving, perhaps quietly hoping she might come back to him, perhaps quietly grateful that she had not, Emma was doing something that would redefine the entire shape of his world without him knowing it. Emma was getting married again. His name was Eugene Ledoux. He was, if the records give us any real picture of him, a man considerably younger than Albert McVicker, a man who was perhaps less experienced in the ways that Emma's kind of experience tends to work on a person. He was charmed by her. Of course he was. Emma, when she chose to be charming, was extraordinarily good at it. She had spent years, perhaps all of her adult life, learning to read what a person wanted and then becoming, as precisely and convincingly as possible, that thing. For Eugene Ledoux, what she became was a wife. They married in 1905. We do not know exactly where or under what circumstances or what name Emma used on the marriage certificate, whether she presented herself as a widow, as a woman whose previous marriage had ended, or as something else entirely. What we know is that Eugene Ledoux became Emma's husband. And what we also know, though Eugene did not know it, was that Albert McVicker was still, under the laws of California and Arizona, Emma's husband too. She was, by the spring of 1906, a bigamist. 2 husbands, 2 lives, 2 separate men who believed they were connected to her, who believed they had some claim on her, who believed, in their different ways and for their different reasons, that Emma Ledoux was their wife. This is where the pressure begins to build. Not dramatically, not all at once, but steadily, quietly, in the way that pressure always builds when a structure is carrying more weight than it was designed to hold. Emma had constructed a life, multiple lives, really, on a foundation of incomplete truths and convenient omissions, and that foundation was beginning, in the spring of 1906, to show its cracks. Albert McVicker had learned, somehow, through mutual acquaintances, through the network of people who knew both of them, through some communication whose exact nature is lost to history, that Emma had remarried. He had learned that the woman he still technically called his wife had married another man. And Albert McVicker, being the kind of man he was, the kind of man who loved deeply and held on to that love perhaps longer than was wise, had not responded to this information by quietly letting go. He had responded by reaching out. He wrote to Emma. We do not have the full text of his letters, but we know they existed, because Emma's subsequent actions are only explicable as a response to something she felt pressed by. He wanted to see her. He wanted, perhaps, to understand. He wanted, and this is speculation, but it is the kind of speculation that fits everything we know about him, to believe that there was still something between them, that their marriage, however frayed, however long dormant, still meant something. And Emma received those letters. She read them, and she made a decision. She would meet him. This is the moment, right here, in the quiet calculation of that decision, where Emma Ledoux's story shifts from the story of a complicated, troubled woman into something darker. Because Emma could have made other choices. She could have told Albert the truth. She could have engaged a lawyer and begun the process of a formal divorce. She could have disappeared more completely, changed her name more thoroughly, made herself harder to find. She had done all of these things before, in various combinations, at various points in her life. But this time, she made a different kind of calculation. And that calculation was the one that would define everything else. She would meet Albert McVicker in Stockton, California. She would present herself as a wife returning to the fold. She would let him believe that a reconciliation was possible, that she was willing to come back to him, that the marriage they had both allowed to drift into dormancy might be revived. She would be warm and familiar and reassuring, the way she was capable of being when she chose to be, and Albert, who had been hoping, in the way that people who love deeply and unwisely often hope, would be disarmed. And then she would deal with the problem. But here is what we have to hold in our minds as we approach this part of the story. Emma Ledoux, in the spring of 1906, was not a woman who had decided to murder her husband. Not yet. Or at least, not entirely. The plan, such as it was, appears to have taken shape gradually, over the days leading up to and then during her reunion with Albert McVicker. It appears to have been, in some ways, an improvisation, a response to circumstances that kept shifting, to a situation that kept feeling more and more dangerous, to a man who kept being more alive, more present, more real than she could afford for him to be. That does not make what she did forgivable. Nothing about what she did is forgivable, but it makes it human. And human is the only lens through which any of this makes sense. She arrived in Stockton in the middle of March, 1906. The city was, in those years, one of California's more significant interior towns, a river port, a railroad hub, a place where the agricultural wealth of the Central Valley was gathered and shipped out to the wider world. It was not glamorous, but it had energy and commerce and the anonymous density of a city large enough that a person could move through it without being immediately known. Emma moved through Stockton with the assurance of someone who had spent years learning to move through places without leaving traces. She checked into a hotel. She signed the register as Mrs. McVicker, and she waited for Albert to arrive. He came. Of course he came. He had been hoping for this. He had been waiting for this. He walked into the hotel and found her there. And whatever happened in those first moments of their reunion, the words they exchanged, the gestures, the weight of all the unsaid things between them, was not witnessed by anyone whose account we have. What we know is that they checked into the hotel together, that they were seen by hotel staff as a couple, that Albert McVicker, in those first hours of their reunion, was alive and animated and apparently happy, and that very soon after their arrival in Stockton, Albert McVicker became ill. He became violently, terrifyingly ill. The symptoms came on fast: nausea, vomiting, a weakness that dropped him to the bed and would not let him up. Emma called for a doctor. She was, to everyone who observed her, a concerned wife. She stood at the bedside. She spoke to the doctor calmly. She answered his questions and nodded at his instructions. She was, in every visible respect, exactly what she appeared to be, a woman worried about her husband. The doctor diagnosed ptomaine poisoning, what we would today call food poisoning, and treated McVicker accordingly. With rest and care, he said, the man should recover fully within a day or two. And Albert McVicker did recover. He rested, and he slept, and the symptoms gradually receded, and after a day or two, he was sitting up in bed and eating and looking more like himself again. He should have left then. He should have gathered himself and his things and walked out of that hotel and put Stockton and Emma behind him, even if he didn't know why he should. But he didn't leave. He stayed. And the day after his recovery, while Albert was resting in the hotel room, Emma Ledoux walked down the street to the office of the doctor who had treated him. She stood in the doorway and she looked at the doctor with steady, dark eyes. And she told him that she herself was unwell, that she suffered from a condition, that she had, in the past, been prescribed a medication for the management of her pain. She said it with the practiced ease of someone who had said it before, or something very like it. She asked him for morphine tablets. The doctor looked at her for a moment. Then he wrote the prescription. And Emma Ledoux walked out of that office with a small paper envelope in her hand and walked back toward the hotel, and something in her posture, in the set of her shoulders, in the deliberateness of her steps, suggested that whatever had been uncertain before was uncertain no longer. She knew what she was going to do, and the night of March 23rd, 1906, was about to begin. The evening of March 23rd, 1906 arrived in Stockton the way evenings arrive in the Central Valley in early spring. Slowly, softly, the light draining out of the sky in long horizontal bands of orange and purple, the air carrying that particular coolness that follows a warm day and makes everything feel slightly unreal, slightly suspended, as though the world is holding its breath between one state and another. Albert McVicker was in good spirits that night. He had recovered from his illness. He felt better than he had in days, perhaps better than he had felt in months. There is something about surviving a physical crisis that clarifies the senses, that makes ordinary pleasures feel more vivid and worthwhile. He was with Emma. He believed they were mending things. He believed that the long, confusing stretch of separation that had defined the past few years was coming to an end, that they were finding their way back to something solid and real. He went out and bought whiskey. 3 bottles, by the accounts that would later be presented in court. 3 bottles of whatever was affordable and available in Stockton in March of 1906. The kind of whiskey that working men bought and drank in hotel rooms at the end of long days when they wanted to feel warm and loose and free from the grind of ordinary life. He brought the bottles back to the hotel room. He and Emma were going to have a drink together. They were going to talk and laugh and be, for a few hours at least, simply a husband and wife having a quiet evening in a hotel room in a river city in California. He did not know what was in Emma's pocket. He could not have known. There was nothing in her behavior, nothing in the warmth she showed him that evening, in the way she smiled when he came through the door with the whiskey, in the ease with which she moved around the room, that would have told him. Emma was many things, but she was not transparent. She had spent her entire life learning to be whatever the moment required. And what the moment required, right then, was a woman who was happy to see her husband come home. She poured the drinks. This detail, this small, domestic act, the lifting of the bottle and the pouring of the liquid into the glass, is the moment that everything pivots on. This is the hinge. This is where one version of the story ends and another, darker version begins. Emma poured the drinks, and in the pouring, in that moment when her back was to the room or her hand moved in a way that was shielded from view, she dissolved the morphine tablets into the whiskey. The morphine came from the prescription she had obtained from the doctor that afternoon. Morphine in 1906 was not the tightly controlled substance it is today. It was used widely, for pain management and for a dozen other conditions, real and imagined. It was sold in pharmacies and prescribed by doctors and existed in the medicine cabinets of ordinary households across America in quantities that would be alarming by modern standards. But morphine in sufficient doses is also lethal. It slows the breathing. It quiets the nervous system. It carries a person from consciousness down through the layers of sleep, and, if the dose is large enough, beyond sleep into a darkness from which there is no return. Emma knew this. She had known it when she asked the doctor for the prescription. She had known it when she walked back to the hotel with the envelope in her hand. She had known it when she laid the tablets out and calculated the dose and thought about the evening ahead with the focused, methodical calm of a person executing a plan. Albert McVicker did not know any of this. He took the glass that Emma handed him. He raised it. Perhaps he said something, a toast, a word, some small gesture of the reunion he believed they were having. Then he drank. The morphine worked in the way that morphine works when it is mixed with alcohol and administered in a significant dose. It worked quickly, and then it worked deeply. Albert McVicker became drowsy, and then confused, and then he could no longer hold himself upright. He sank onto the bed. His eyes closed. His breathing slowed. His body, which had recovered so recently from what he thought was food poisoning and which was, it must be noted, still somewhat weakened from that experience, surrendered to the drug with the helplessness of something that has simply run out of resistance. He lost consciousness, and Emma Ledoux stood in the hotel room and looked at him for a long moment. What she felt in that moment, whether there was grief or relief or something more complicated that doesn't have a clean name, we cannot know. The internal life of Emma Ledoux in the hours of March 23rd and into the early hours of March 24th is not documented anywhere, and even if it were, we would have to approach it with caution. People do not always feel what we expect them to feel in moments of crisis. Sometimes they feel nothing at all, which is perhaps the most frightening thing of all. What we know is what she did next. And what she did next tells us something about the state of her mind, if not the exact emotional texture of it. She did not panic. She did not call for help. She did not leave the room and pretend none of this had happened. She stood in that hotel room in Stockton, California, with her unconscious husband on the bed and 3 bottles of whiskey on the table and the remains of the evening around her, and she began to think. Investigators would later believe, based on the physical evidence and the testimony of witnesses, that Emma did not simply wait for Albert McVicker to die from the morphine alone. They believed, and the evidence supports this conclusion, though the details are too disturbing to dwell on here, that she may have taken steps to ensure his death that went beyond the poisoning. That before the night was over, Albert McVicker's death may have involved not just the drug in his bloodstream, but also the physical actions of the woman standing over him. Whatever happened in that room, Albert McVicker was dead before morning. And with his death, Emma Ledoux's problem changed shape. When Albert McVicker was alive, he was a threat. He was a man who knew things about her, who knew she had remarried, who knew her secrets, who could, if he chose to, expose the bigamy that sat at the center of her carefully constructed double life. A living Albert McVicker was a problem that required management, careful handling, the kind of delicate ongoing work that Emma had been doing for years. A dead Albert McVicker was a different kind of problem entirely. A dead Albert McVicker was evidence. And Emma, standing in that hotel room in the early hours of March 24th, with the evidence lying still on the bed in front of her, had to figure out what to do with it. She began planning in the way she always began planning, methodically, practically, without apparent sentiment. She was going to need a container, something large enough to hold a man, something that could be moved without attracting attention, something that could be shipped, like luggage, like furniture, like the ordinary cargo of a life being relocated. She was going to need a trunk. The next morning, the morning of March 24th, 1906, Emma Ledoux walked out of the hotel and into the streets of Stockton. She had slept, or she had not slept, and in either case, she presented to the world the face of a woman simply going about her business. She went to a hardware store. She purchased rope. She went to another establishment and arranged for the purchase and delivery of a large trunk. She did all of this with the calm, focused efficiency of a woman running errands on an ordinary day, speaking to clerks, exchanging money, saying please and thank you, behaving in every outward respect like a person with nothing to hide. The trunk was delivered to the hotel. Emma supervised its arrival. She brought it to the room. And then she did the thing that no amount of historical distance makes easy to contemplate. She placed Albert McVicker's body inside it. She folded him in. She packed him around with whatever materials were available to manage the space and slow the processes that begin in a body after death. She closed the lid. She secured it with the rope she had purchased. And then she arranged for the trunk to be transported to the Stockton Railroad Depot, to be checked as baggage on a train that would carry it away from Stockton, away from California if she was lucky, away from the life she had built with Albert McVicker, and toward the life she had built with Eugene Ledoux, the life she was determined to protect at any cost. There was one thing she forgot, or perhaps it was not forgetting. Perhaps it was haste, or distraction, or the kind of small error that accumulates when a person is trying to manage too many things at once. Perhaps she simply ran out of time, or nerve, or the particular kind of calm required to attend to every detail when the stakes are this high. She did not attach a baggage tag to the trunk. Without a tag, the trunk could not be routed. Without a tag, the depot workers had no instructions for it. Without a tag, the trunk sat. And while it sat, the afternoon stretched on, and the temperature in the baggage room did what temperature does in California in late March, and the inevitable processes that no trunk and no amount of rope can stop began to make themselves known to everyone in the vicinity. And then the workers moved the trunk, and something inside it thumped, and one of the men placed his hand against the side and felt the dense, damp stillness of something that had no business being in a trunk at a railroad depot, and he told his co-worker to go get the police. And the trunk was opened, and Albert McVicker was found, and Emma Ledoux's plan, which had been, in its conception, so thorough and so careful and so brutally practical, collapsed in the most mundane possible way, not because of brilliant detective work, not because of a witness who came forward with a dramatic revelation, but because of a missing piece of paper, a baggage tag, a small, rectangular slip of cardboard that cost nothing and meant everything and was not there. All of Emma's planning, all of her calculation, all of the terrible risk she had taken in that hotel room on the night of March 23rd, all of it undone by the absence of a tag. She did not know this yet, of course. By the time the trunk was opened and Albert McVicker's body identified, Emma was already on the move. She had left Stockton as she always left places, quietly, quickly, without ceremony. She had taken what was useful, money, the watch that had belonged to Albert McVicker, which she apparently could not bring herself to leave behind, and she had made her way towards San Francisco, the city that has always been California's refuge for people who need to disappear. San Francisco in 1906 was a city on the eve of its own catastrophe. In just a few weeks, on the morning of April 18th, the great earthquake would arrive and the fires that followed it would reduce much of the city to ash and ruin. But in those last weeks of March, the city was still itself, dense, vibrant, cosmopolitan, full of theaters and restaurants and hotels, and the kind of anonymous, overlapping crowds that give a person the comfortable sense that they are invisible. Emma was not invisible. She was never truly invisible, because Emma was the kind of person who could not help being noticed. But in San Francisco, she was at least anonymous. She checked into a hotel under a name that was not her own. She moved through the city with the practiced ease of a woman who had been moving through cities and reinventing herself for 20 years. She met, in San Francisco, a young man named Joseph Healy, who was apparently smitten with her and who appears to have had no idea what she had just done or what she was running from. She told him that Albert McVicker had died naturally. She said it easily, convincingly, in the way she said everything that she needed people to believe. McVicker had been ill. He had passed away. She was a widow. Joseph Healy believed her. But the newspapers were not as easy to manage as Joseph Healy. By the time Emma arrived in San Francisco, the story of the trunk at the Stockton Depot was already filling the front pages of California's papers. The discovery had been dramatic enough, and the circumstances strange enough, that the press had fastened onto it with the particular intensity that a genuinely bizarre crime story provokes. And the name Emma Ledoux, the name the hotel register had given the police, the name the doctor remembered, the name the clerk remembered, the name that kept appearing in every witness account from the Stockton Hotel, was being printed in bold letters across the state of California. Joseph Healy picked up a newspaper. He read the front page. He looked at the name. He looked at the woman sitting across from him. He put the newspaper down and he looked at her for a long time without saying anything. Emma looked back at him with those steady, dark eyes. And somewhere in the exchange that followed, somewhere in the silence between them, Emma Ledoux understood that San Francisco was no longer safe. She had to move again, but the net was already closing. The moment the Stockton police had identified Emma Ledoux as their suspect, they had done what law enforcement in 1906 did when they needed to find someone fast. They had used the telegraph. Alerts had gone out along every major rail line in the state. Her name, her description, the aliases she was known to use. All of it was moving along the wires faster than any train could carry her. She took a train toward Antioch. It was, perhaps, an instinctive choice. Antioch was smaller, quieter, the kind of town where she might blend in more easily than she could in a major city. She checked into a hotel under a false name. She settled in, as she had settled into so many hotels in so many towns, with the professional calm of someone who has learned to make any temporary space feel like home. But the sheriff's deputies were already on their way. They had traced her through the telegraph alerts, through a combination of witnesses and informants, and the simple, grinding persistence of investigators who had her name and her description and the certainty that she had not yet crossed state lines. They arrived at the Antioch Hotel. They asked at the front desk. They were directed upstairs. They knocked on the door. There was a pause, a long pause, the kind of pause that contains within it a decision being made, a calculation being run, a person on the other side of a closed door choosing between the different available responses to a knock that can only mean one thing. The door opened. Emma Ledoux stood in the doorway. She was dressed and composed and entirely, almost insultingly calm. She looked at the deputies standing in the corridor and she said, reportedly, according to the account that was later given, "I know what you want with me." 6 words. No surprise, no fear, or none that she allowed to show. Just those 6 words and those steady eyes and the absolute, unnerving self-possession of a woman who had been waiting for this moment, on some level, from the minute the trunk had left her hands. The deputies stepped forward. In Emma's purse, the bag she had been carrying since she left Stockton, they found Albert McVicker's watch. She had taken it. After everything. After the planning and the morphine and the trunk and the flight. After all of the careful, methodical work of a woman determined to leave no traces. She had taken his watch and put it in her purse and carried it with her across the state of California. Why? We will never know for certain. But there is something in that detail, something in the keeping of the watch, that suggests a dimension of Emma Ledoux's inner life that the rest of the story makes it easy to overlook. She was not simply cold. She was not simply calculating. There was something in her relationship to Albert McVicker that was more complicated than the actions of March 23rd and 24th might suggest. She had loved him, once, or something that functioned like love, and the watch was what remained of that. But the watch was also evidence. And evidence, in the hands of the Stockton police, was going to tell a story. The deputies placed handcuffs on Emma Ledoux's wrists. They escorted her out of the hotel and into the waiting world, into the newspapers and the courtrooms and the public gaze that would dissect her life with the particular thoroughness that the era reserved for women who had stepped so thoroughly outside the boundaries of what women were supposed to be. Emma was taken back to Stockton. The trial was coming. And California was about to discover that the story of the trunk in the railroad depot was, in all its dark dimensions, only the surface of something much deeper and much stranger than anyone had yet imagined. The news of Emma Ledoux's arrest moved through California like a current through water, fast, pervasive, touching everything it passed through and leaving nothing quite unchanged. The newspapers, which had already been writing about the trunk at the Stockton depot with the barely contained excitement of reporters who know they are sitting on a story people will not be able to stop reading, now had the full picture. Or what they believed was the full picture. The truth, as investigations like this one tend to reveal, was considerably more layered than anyone first understood. California in 1906 was a state in which women occupied a very particular kind of public space. They were present, certainly. They were visible in their communities, active in their families, essential to the economic and social fabric of everyday life. But in the press, in the courts, in the formal institutions of public life, women appeared primarily in a small number of predefined roles. They were wives. They were mothers. They were, occasionally and cautiously, victims. What they were almost never allowed to be, in the public imagination of that era, was complicated, was fully human, was the kind of person who could make a decision like the one Emma Ledoux appeared to have made and have reasons for it. Not good reasons, not defensible reasons, but reasons that existed within a recognizable human experience rather than simply emerging from some bottomless well of feminine evil. The press, predictably, did not take the complicated view. The press took the view that sold papers. Emma Ledoux was immediately and comprehensively cast as a monster, a seductress, a black widow, a woman whose beauty and cunning had made her more dangerous than any man, because a man who committed violence was at least explicable within the framework of male aggression, while a woman who committed violence violated something much more fundamental, the assumption that women were, by their nature, nurturing and gentle and safe. She was given a name in the headlines, the trunk murderess. It was a name designed to do several things at once. It emphasized the method, the trunk, the shipping of a human body like cargo, which was genuinely unusual and genuinely disturbing and genuinely the kind of detail that lodges in the imagination and won't let go. It identified Emma by her alleged crime rather than by her name, which served the purpose of reducing her to her worst act. And it had a rhythm to it, a dark music that made it easy to print and easy to say and easy to remember. The trunk murderess, Emma Ledoux. The name stuck for the rest of her life, and well beyond it. In Stockton, meanwhile, the investigative work was proceeding with the methodical thoroughness that a case with this much public attention demands. The police had a body. They had a victim, Albert McVicker, identified, examined by the county physician, confirmed as dead by poisoning. They had a suspect, Emma Ledoux, in custody, composed, refusing to say anything beyond the minimal responses required of her. And they had, in the various witnesses and material evidence scattered across Stockton and the surrounding area, the building blocks of a case. They began to assemble those building blocks with care. The doctor who had treated McVicker during his first illness, the episode diagnosed as ptomaine poisoning, came forward and gave a statement. He described the symptoms he had observed, the treatment he had administered, and McVicker's recovery. He also described Emma's visit to his office the following day, when she had requested morphine tablets, claiming personal addiction as her reason. He had given her the prescription. He told the investigators this with the quiet discomfort of a man who has realized, in retrospect, that he was a step in a chain of events he did not understand at the time and wishes he could have prevented. He described Emma's demeanor during the visit: calm, specific in her request, not noticeably distressed or anxious. Just a woman asking for a prescription. The hardware store clerk who had sold Emma the rope came forward. He remembered her clearly. She was, as multiple witnesses would attest, the kind of woman who was easy to remember. He described the transaction in detail: what she had asked for, how much she had bought, how she had paid for it, how she had carried it away. The trunk merchant remembered her as well. He described the trunk she had purchased, its dimensions, its construction, the price she had paid. He described how she had arranged for its delivery to the hotel address she gave him. The baggage workers at the depot told the story of the trunk's arrival, the passage of hours, the growing smell, the terrible discovery. The hotel staff described the couple who had checked in together as Mr. and Mrs. McVicker. They described Emma, her appearance, her manner, her calmness. They described seeing her in the corridor, at the desk, in the lobby. One employee recalled that on the morning after McVicker's disappearance from the hotel, Emma had seemed entirely ordinary. Not distressed, not hurried, just a guest checking out. Each piece of evidence was, in itself, not necessarily conclusive. A woman could buy rope without intending harm. A woman could purchase a trunk for entirely legitimate reasons. A woman could obtain a morphine prescription while genuinely addicted. But the pieces together, the prescription obtained the day before the death, the rope purchased that morning, the trunk acquired and delivered to the hotel, the body folded inside and sent to the depot, described a sequence of events that had only one coherent explanation. Emma Ledoux had planned to kill Albert McVicker, and then she had killed him. The question that the investigators, and, later, the prosecutor would need to address was motive. A murder without motive is prosecutable, but difficult. A murder with a clear, understandable motive is the kind of case that juries can follow and convict on. The motive, when it was uncovered, turned out to be more than sufficient. Because the investigation into Emma Ledoux's background, the digging through marriage records and court documents and the accounts of people who had known her in various towns and under various names, revealed something that explained everything. Emma had been married to Albert McVicker in 1902. The record was clear and unambiguous. And in 1905, she had married Eugene Ledoux. The record of that marriage was equally clear and unambiguous. The two records sat side by side, and between them existed no divorce, no legal dissolution of the first marriage, no document of any kind that would have made the second marriage anything other than bigamy. Emma Ledoux was a bigamist, and Albert McVicker, who had reached out to her, who had traveled to Stockton to meet her, who had drunk the whiskey she poured for him, Albert McVicker had been the living proof of that bigamy. As long as he was alive, he was a threat to everything Emma had constructed with Eugene Ledoux. As long as he was alive, her second marriage was a fraud. As long as he was alive, the comfortable life she was building, or believed she was building, could be pulled apart at any moment by a man who knew her real history. Dead, he was simply a problem that had been solved. The prosecution saw this clearly. The jury would see it clearly too, in time. But first there was the matter of Emma's defense. Emma Ledoux, in the weeks and months between her arrest and her trial, maintained a particular kind of public composure that the press found simultaneously fascinating and infuriating. She was not what people expected a murderer to look like. She was not wild-eyed or disheveled or visibly consumed by guilt. She was, in the accounts of the journalists who observed her and the officials who processed her through the system, well-dressed, polite, and remarkably self-contained. She answered questions briefly and without apparent distress. She ate her meals. She slept. She did not confess. She did not break down. She did not do any of the things that the public narrative of female criminality expected her to do. She simply existed in her captivity with the same focused self-possession she had apparently brought to every other situation in her life. Her legal team, when the trial finally began, constructed a defense around a story that Emma had provided them. It was, frankly, not a very good story, but it was the story they had, and they presented it with as much conviction as they could manage. According to Emma, she had not killed Albert McVicker. She had been in the hotel room with him, yes. She had been present when he became ill. But the person responsible for McVicker's death was a man named Joe Miller, a figure Emma described as an associate of McVicker's, someone with whom McVicker had business dealings, someone who had a reason to want him dead. Joe Miller, Emma claimed, had come to the hotel room. Joe Miller had been the one with the morphine. Joe Miller had administered the dose. Emma was simply a witness, a frightened woman who had seen what happened and panicked, who had made the terrible, indefensible decision to hide the body rather than call for help, not because she had killed McVicker herself, but because she feared that no one would believe her innocence. The jury listened to this account with the patient attention that juries bring to everything, and then the prosecution began methodically and thoroughly dismantling it. Because Joe Miller did not exist, the investigators had searched. They had searched through every record, every account, every name they could find connected to Albert McVicker's life and movements in the weeks before his death. They had interviewed the people who had known McVicker, who had worked with him, who had encountered him in Stockton during the days he spent there with Emma. They had found no one named Joe Miller. No one who had seen a man matching the description Emma gave. No record of any such person in any relevant context. Joe Miller was a fiction, a name Emma had generated to give her defense a shape it otherwise entirely lacked. The prosecution called the doctor. He testified about the morphine prescription, about the exact phrasing of Emma's request, about the specific nature of the drug she had obtained. The prosecution called the hardware store clerk. He testified about the rope. The prosecution called the trunk merchant. He testified about the trunk. The prosecution called the baggage workers. They testified about the smell, the sound of the thump, the terrible moment the lid was lifted. The prosecution called the hotel staff. They testified that no one matching the description of Joe Miller had been seen entering or leaving the room on the relevant night. One by one, each piece of evidence settled into place. Each testimony added another layer to the picture. And the picture, fully assembled, showed Emma Ledoux and Emma Ledoux alone. No mysterious third party, no conspiratorial associate, no Joe Miller materializing from the shadows to commit the crime and then vanish again without a trace. Just Emma, and the morphine, and the trunk. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. In a case with this much evidence, 6 hours is not a short deliberation. It is, in fact, a deliberation that suggests the jury took its responsibility seriously, that the 12 people in that room understood the weight of what they were being asked to decide and did not arrive at their conclusion carelessly. But they did arrive at it. Guilty. Emma Ledoux was found guilty of murder in the first degree. And then the judge pronounced her sentence. And what he said next made Emma Ledoux, in a single moment, something that no woman in California had ever been before. He sentenced her to death by hanging. Emma Ledoux was the first woman in California ever to receive the death penalty. The courtroom went still when the judge read the sentence. Not silent. A courtroom with public galleries never goes entirely silent, but still in the way that a crowd goes still when something happens that exceeds the frame of what they had prepared themselves to witness. The journalists in their gallery scrambled for their notebooks. The members of the public in the gallery sat with open mouths. The members of the jury, who had given their verdict and might have expected the sentencing to feel like resolution, sat instead with the particular discomfort of people who have done the thing they were asked to do and are now uncertain about what that thing means. Emma stood when the sentence was read. She did not flinch. She did not weep. She looked at the judge with those steady eyes and received his words with the same self-contained composure that she had shown throughout the trial, throughout the investigation, throughout every public moment since her arrest. Whatever Emma Ledoux felt in that moment, she did not show it to anyone in that courtroom. She was taken back to her cell, and the state of California prepared to execute its first female prisoner. But that is not how this story ends. Because Emma Ledoux's lawyers were not finished. And the legal system, which had moved so efficiently to convict her, was about to reveal a different dimension of its efficiency, its capacity, in certain circumstances, to reverse itself. The appeals process was filed almost immediately. Emma's defense team raised questions about the trial, about the evidence, about the conduct of the proceedings, about the instructions given to the jury. These were not frivolous questions. They were the kind of substantive legal challenges that appellate courts are designed to evaluate, and when the appeals court looked at the case, they found enough to work with. The verdict was overturned. A new trial was ordered. Emma Ledoux would not hang. Not yet. Perhaps not ever. But she was not free. She was still in custody. She was still facing the full weight of California's legal system. She was still Emma Ledoux, the trunk murderess, the woman whose name had been on the front page of every newspaper in the state for the better part of a year. And now, with a second trial looming, she had to decide what to do. She thought about it for a long time. She sat in her cell and she thought about Joe Miller, who had never existed, and about the jury that had convicted her in 6 hours, and about the evidence that had assembled itself against her with such horrible completeness. She thought about the doctor and the rope merchant and the trunk seller and the baggage workers, all of those ordinary people who had been present at various points in the chain of her plan and who had, when asked, told the truth. And then Emma Ledoux made the decision that would define the final decades of her life. She wrote a letter. The letter said, simply and without the extensive elaboration you might expect from a woman who had spent months maintaining her innocence, she would plead guilty. Not to murder in the first degree. The plea negotiation reduced the charge. But she would plead guilty to the killing of Albert McVicker, the story she had been telling, about Joe Miller and the mysterious death and the frightened wife who had panicked, was over. Emma was putting it down. She was acknowledging, in the limited but real way that a guilty plea acknowledges, that what had happened in that hotel room in Stockton was her doing. The judge who received her plea was a man named W. B. Nutter. He was not, by the accounts of those who observed him, a sentimental man. He was a judge who believed in the law and in its application, and he had before him a woman who had been convicted of murder, whose conviction had been overturned on procedural grounds, and who was now pleading guilty to the killing. He sentenced her to life in prison. Emma Ledoux, the trunk murderess, would spend the rest of her life behind the walls of the California state prison system. She would not hang. She would not walk free. She would simply remain, year after year, decade after decade, in the custody of the state she had shocked and scandalized and forced to confront questions it had not been prepared to ask. That was 1906, and there were still 35 more years ahead of her. The California Institution for Women did not yet exist when Emma Ledoux began her sentence. The state's prison system in the early 20th century was not designed with women in mind, or rather, it was designed with women only as an afterthought, as a small and awkward subset of a carceral system built around the assumption that the people it primarily needed to house were men. Women prisoners in California in 1906 and the years that followed were managed within the larger male facilities, in separate wings or separate buildings that offered a degree of physical separation from the general population, but very little else in the way of accommodation for the realities of women's lives. Emma arrived at the prison in the way that all prisoners arrive, stripped of the external markers that had defined her public identity, issued the institutional clothing and routines and regulations that reduced every inmate, regardless of their history, to a number and a classification and a daily schedule. She was, from the moment she entered those walls, no longer the trunk murderess of the California newspapers. She was not Emma Ledoux the bigamist, the seductress, the woman whose story had commanded front-page attention for months. She was a prisoner. She was an inmate. She was, within the internal world of the institution, simply one person among many people who had all arrived by different roads at the same destination. How Emma experienced those first years in prison, the adaptation, the loss of freedom, the particular psychological adjustment required when the wide-ranging, restless life she had led was compressed into the rigid dimensions of incarceration, is not documented in any great detail. What we have are official records. Her intake, her classification, the periodic evaluations that the prison system required. We have a few fragments of correspondence that have survived the years. We have the accounts of prison officials who spoke, occasionally, to journalists who sought them out over the decades of Emma's confinement. What those fragments suggest is a woman who adapted, who found, within the narrow world available to her, some way to exist, who worked, as prisoners in that era were required to work, at whatever tasks the institution assigned, who was, by the accounts of the officials who managed her, not a difficult prisoner, not rebellious, not disruptive, cooperative, even, in the way that some prisoners become cooperative, not from any warm feeling toward the institution, but from the pragmatic recognition that cooperation is the most efficient way to navigate a world you cannot escape and can only make more or less bearable through your own choices. The years passed, one at a time, in the way that years pass in confinement, slowly, marked not by the seasons or the events of the outside world, but by the internal rhythm of institutional life. Meals and work and sleep and the returning certainty, day after day, that tomorrow will look exactly like today. But Emma Ledoux was not a person who simply endured. She was, had always been, a person who sought advantage, who looked for doors and opened them. And the California parole system, in those years, was a door. A slow door, a difficult door, a door that required years of institutional good behavior and the support of officials who would vouch for you and the approval of a board that had the authority to decide whether you had been punished enough. But it was a door. Emma Ledoux was paroled for the first time in the 1920s. We do not know exactly what she did with that freedom, or how long it lasted, or what the precise circumstances of its ending were. What we know is that she was returned to prison. She had violated the terms of her parole in some way that the records describe without much elaboration. The nature of the violation, whether it was something relatively minor, a technical breach of conditions, or something more substantial, is not entirely clear. What is clear is that the freedom Emma had worked toward for years was taken back, and she was returned to the institution that had been her world for so long. She was paroled again, and returned again. The pattern repeated itself, like a tide going out and coming back in, each time leaving Emma in essentially the same place. Older, quieter, shaped by the decades of incarceration in ways that even her remarkable adaptability could not entirely prevent. Meanwhile, the world outside was changing in ways that Emma, from within the walls of the prison, could only observe at a distance. The earthquake that had destroyed much of San Francisco in April of 1906, just weeks after her arrest, had already been rebuilt over. The First World War had come and gone, taking a generation of young men with it. The 1920s had roared and then crashed into the depression of the 1930s. The country Emma Ledoux had moved through so freely in her youth, the open, mobile, reinvention-friendly landscape of the American West, was becoming something different. More regulated, more documented, more the kind of place where a person's identity was harder to shed and harder to replace. But the world inside the prison walls was also changing. California's prison system was slowly, haltingly, beginning to develop more coherent and humane policies for the management of female prisoners. Advocates were arguing for separate facilities, for better conditions, for programs that addressed the specific needs of incarcerated women. Emma's long confinement placed her at an intersection of these changes. She was old enough to have entered a system built on 19th century assumptions and to have lived through the early stages of its 20th century evolution. She had been in prison for decades by the time the 1930s arrived. She was past 60 years old, which, in that era and in that context, was genuinely old. The vibrant, dangerous, Quicksilver woman who had charmed and deceived and ultimately killed in the gaslit California of 1906 had been replaced, year by year, by something quieter, something diminished. Not because Emma had become simple, or gentle, or fully reconciled to her situation, but because decades of incarceration do something to a person that cannot be undone. They sand down the edges. They slow the movements. They replace the restless forward orientation of a person who is always looking for the next thing with the resigned, rearward gaze of a person whose life has become, in its essential shape, a single sustained act of waiting. Emma Ledoux died in 1941. She was 66 years old, by most accounts. She died in custody, still a prisoner of the state of California, still serving the life sentence that Judge Nutter had imposed on her 35 years earlier. The death was quiet, unremarkable by any standard except the simple standard of a human life coming to its end. There was no deathbed confession, no final statement, no dramatic last act of the woman who had once commanded the attention of an entire state. There was just Emma, and then the absence of Emma, in a room inside a California prison in 1941. The newspapers that covered her death were not the same newspapers that had covered her arrest and trial. The reporters who wrote the obituaries were not the people who had written the original stories. The language had changed, the context had changed, and even the name, the Trunk Murderess, had begun to fade from the cultural memory in the way that names fade when the people who remember them firsthand are themselves growing old and passing on. But the trunk itself had not faded. This is one of the more remarkable footnotes to Emma Ledoux's story. The physical trunk into which she had placed Albert McVicker's body, the wooden slatted container that had sat in the Stockton Railroad Depot and been found by those workers on the morning of March 24, 1906. That trunk had been preserved. It had been kept, first as evidence, then as a historical artifact, and eventually found its way into the collection of a museum, where it sits today in the physical, three-dimensional, undeniable reality of a thing that was once part of a terrible event and has survived that event by more than a century. There is something about that trunk that resists easy categorization. It is not a monument, exactly. It is not a memorial. It is simply an object, a box, really, made of wood and metal, that was once used to contain a human body and that has endured long past the deaths of everyone involved in its story. Standing near it, if you ever have the opportunity, you are confronted with the strange fact of physical objects' indifference to the human drama surrounding them. The trunk does not know what it carried. It does not grieve. It does not explain or justify or condemn. It simply exists, exactly as it has existed for over 100 years, waiting for people to look at it and draw whatever conclusions they need to draw. Albert McVicker, who was 40 years old when he died in that Stockton hotel room, is the person whose absence the trunk most powerfully speaks to. He was not a famous man. He was not a man whose name would have appeared in any newspaper if not for the manner of his death. He was a working man, a husband, technically a husband, who had loved a woman who could not afford to be loved by him, who had traveled to Stockton in the hope of reconciliation and been given instead a glass of poisoned whiskey in a gaslit room. He deserved better. He deserved, at the very minimum, the chance to make choices about his own life without those choices being made for him by someone who had already decided that his continued existence was inconvenient. He deserved to be known as more than the body in the trunk. His life had a shape before that March night. He had worked, had hoped, had moved through the world with the ordinary dignity of a person who was simply trying to make something decent of the time he had. He had loved Emma, which speaks to something generous in him, an openness to love, a willingness to be vulnerable to another person, even if that love was ultimately, tragically, misplaced. He had reached out to her when he could have let things lie, which speaks to a kind of courage, or perhaps a kind of hope that refused to accept the evidence accumulating around it. He was a person, fully human, fully alive, right up until the moment that Emma made him otherwise. And he is worth remembering tonight, in this space, as we think about the full dimensions of this story. Not as a cautionary figure, not as an illustration of any moral lesson, simply as a man who was named Albert McVicker, who was born and lived and worked and loved and died in California, and who deserved a longer and better story than the one he got. Now, before we go on, and we will go on, because there is still much more to explore in Emma's story, in the full dimensions of the life she lived and the choices she made and the questions that remain unanswered about her history, I want to take a breath with you for a moment. If you have been listening from the beginning, you have been with this story for a while now. If you are still awake, leave me a comment. Tell me where you are in the world. Tell me what time it is in your part of it. There is something lovely about knowing that people in different corners of the earth are settling in with the same story, each in their own bed, their own darkness, their own moment of rest at the end of whatever kind of day they have had. If this story is helping you find that rest, please take a moment to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. It genuinely helps this work continue, and it helps the stories reach people who need them. Now take a slow breath. Let your body settle. We are going to go back, in the next section, to the beginning of Emma's story, before Stockton, before McVicker, before the trunk. We are going to go back to the woman she was before the woman everyone knows she became, and try to understand the landscape from which everything else grew. Because Emma Ledoux did not emerge fully formed into the gaslit world of 1906. She was built, over decades, from the materials of a specific time and place and the choices she made, and the choices that were made for her within that time and place. And understanding that landscape is the only way to understand why a woman who was, in many ways, intelligent and capable and possessed of real human warmth, could find herself standing in a hotel room in Stockton at 1 in the morning, looking at a man she had once cared for, and choosing what she chose. Let's go back to Amador County, back to the California of Emma's childhood, before the trunk, before the trial, before any of it. Back to when Emma was simply a girl who wanted more than the world she'd been born into, and hadn't yet discovered how dangerous that wanting could be. We go back there now. Amador County sits in the western foothills of the Sierra Nevada, in the heart of what Californians call Gold Rush country. Today it is a place known for its vineyards and its small towns and the gentle, rolling beauty of the foothill landscape. In the 1870s and 1880s, when Emma Cole was growing up there, it was something rawer and more complicated. A landscape still actively shaped by the memory of the gold rush, still populated by the mixture of ambition and disappointment that the rush had deposited there when it finally subsided. The towns of Amador County in Emma's childhood were the kinds of towns that grew up fast around extractive industries and then had to figure out what they were when the most intense phase of extraction was over. They were not poor towns, exactly, but they were towns where the difference between comfortable and struggling was not very large, where fortunes could be made and lost quickly, where the social fabric had been woven together by people who had come from every conceivable background and were still, collectively, negotiating the terms of their shared existence. Into this world, Emma Teresa Cole was born in 1875. Her parents were people of whom very little record survives beyond their names and their presence in the county records of that era. What we can infer from the fragments that do survive is that they were not wealthy. Wealthy families in Amador County left more abundant records, but they were not destitute either. They occupied that broad middle ground of respectable working life that characterized most of the families in that region in that era. They owned a home. They managed their affairs. They sent their children to school when school was available, which in rural California in the 1870s and 1880s was not as reliably and consistently available as it would later become. Emma received the education that was customary for girls of her background and era. Enough reading and writing and arithmetic to be functional in the domestic and commercial life of a small California town, and the domestic skills that were considered essential for any girl who would one day run a household. She would have learned to cook, to sew, to manage the rhythms of domestic production that were, in the pre-industrial rural household, genuinely demanding and genuinely skilled work, regardless of how invisible that work often became in the broader cultural accounting. But there are glimpses, in the later accounts of people who remembered Emma from her early life, of something in her that did not quite fit the domestic frame she was being prepared for. A quickness of mind that found the pace of ordinary life frustrating. A sharpness of eye that saw opportunities and limitations with equal clarity. An energy that was always slightly in excess of what her immediate circumstances required, always pressing against the boundaries of whatever space it was confined to. She was, in the language of the era, a spirited girl. This was not entirely a compliment. Spirited girls in 19th century California were girls who needed to be managed, who needed the excess of their nature redirected toward appropriate channels, toward a good marriage, toward the management of a busy household, toward the raising of children who would benefit from their mother's energy without being overwhelmed by it. Emma was not very successfully managed. The first marriage, to the man recorded only as Barrett, came when Emma was still young enough that the word young requires emphasis. She was, depending on the precise dates which are not entirely clear in the surviving records, somewhere in her late teens or barely into her 20s when she married for the first time. This was not unusual. Marriage in that era and that community was expected to come early for women, and a woman who had reached her mid-20s without marrying was an object of some concern to the people around her. But Barrett, whatever he was like as a person, was not the answer to whatever question Emma was asking with her life. The marriage ended quickly. The precise circumstances are lost. Whether there was conflict, incompatibility, the specific kind of mismatch between two people who should not have come together, or something else entirely. We simply do not know. What we know is that Emma emerged from the marriage alone and apparently not particularly devastated by its ending. This resilience in the face of failure, the ability to close one door and walk toward the next one without extended grief or apparent self-doubt, would be one of the most consistent qualities of Emma's adult life. It served her in some ways. It protected her, perhaps, from the kind of paralyzing self-examination that can prevent people from moving forward after loss. But it also contributed to a pattern of behavior that, viewed in retrospect, looks increasingly concerning. The ease with which Emma shed one identity and assumed another, the speed with which one relationship was replaced by the next, the absence of apparent hesitation in moving from one life to a fundamentally different one. After Barrett came a period that is less well documented than the marriages, a time during which Emma moved through California in ways that the official records capture only incompletely. She appears in some places under her maiden name, in others under Barrett's name. She is glimpsed in the records of towns she passed through, in the accounts of people who remembered a dark-haired woman moving through their community with more purpose than most transients. She was, during this period, building the skill set of the self-reinventor, learning how easy it was, in the vast and mobile landscape of the American West, to be whoever you needed to be in any given place. This is the period during which Emma is believed to have had her first experiences in the kinds of establishments that polite society preferred not to name. The brothels and saloons and other informal economies that existed in the rougher corners of Western towns offered women of limited means and high survival instincts a way to earn money that was, in its own way, more honest than many of the alternatives available to them. Emma was not the first woman and would not be the last to find herself in this world, and the judgment that history has sometimes applied to this period of her life tells us more about the era's assumptions than it tells us about Emma herself. What it does tell us about Emma is this: she learned, in those years, how to read people. She learned how to assess what a man wanted and how to give it to him convincingly enough to extract what she needed in return. She learned the economies of charm, how much effort was required to get how much in return, and how to calculate the optimal investment. These were not skills she had been taught in Amador County. These were skills she learned in the field, in the difficult school of a life without a safety net, and she learned them thoroughly. When she met William Williams, she was already, in important respects, a different person from the girl who had grown up in Amador County. She had been reshaped by experience, by freedom and necessity and the particular education of a woman who has had to manage her own survival without institutional support. She was sharper. She was more controlled. She was capable of performing, convincingly and sustainably, versions of herself that were tailored to specific audiences. William Williams saw the version Emma chose to show him, and he married that version. Their life in Arizona was, to all outward appearances, a conventional one. Emma managed the household. Williams worked. They existed within the ordinary rhythms of life in a small Arizona town, and the people who knew them saw what Emma wanted them to see: a couple, a wife and husband, an ordinary domestic arrangement. What was happening beneath the surface of that arrangement is something we can only infer. Emma was calculating, always. She was watching, always. She was assessing what she had and what she needed and what the gap between those two things required her to do. And when William Williams became ill, from whatever cause, which was never definitively established, she moved through the stages of his illness and his death with the composed attention of a woman who had already, on some level, planned for this outcome. The insurance money was collected. The grief, such as it was expressed with appropriate restraint and then put away. And Emma moved on. This is the most disturbing possibility that the history of Emma Ledoux raises, and it is a possibility we have to name directly even though we cannot prove it. The possibility that William Williams' death was not the first time Emma had taken a life. The parallels are clear enough. A husband, an illness with ambiguous causes, a life insurance policy, a woman who collected the payout and moved on with remarkable speed and no apparent emotional damage. The investigators who would later study Emma's history raised these parallels explicitly. The prosecution in the McVicker case attempted to introduce evidence about Williams' death, though with limited success. But we do not have definitive proof. The records of William's illness and death are not detailed enough to establish with certainty what caused him to die. The insurance collection, while suggestive in context, is not evidence of murder. The speed of Emma's recovery could reflect grief that was simply not visible to observers, or it could reflect something more troubling. We hold this uncertainty carefully. We do not convict Emma Ledoux of killing William Williams, because the evidence does not support that conviction. But we do not dismiss the possibility either, because dismissing it would require us to look away from the pattern. The emerging, troubling pattern of a woman who moved through marriages and collected their financial residue and moved on, leaving behind her a trail of deaths and departures that the law never fully examined. And then she met Albert McVicker, and this time, the law would examine everything. Albert McVicker came into Emma's life in the early years of the new century, in the way that people came into each other's lives in those years, through the networks of acquaintance and proximity that defined community life before the modern era. They met, they were drawn to each other, and they married in 1902. Albert was, as we have said, a working man of steady habits and genuine emotional warmth. He saw in Emma something that many people saw: the vitality, the sharpness, the dark-eyed presence that made a room feel more charged when she was in it. He did not see, or chose not to see, the calculation beneath the charm. Their marriage was troubled almost from the beginning, in the way that marriages built on incomplete information tend to be troubled. Albert wanted a settled life. He wanted the kind of domesticity that Emma was capable of performing, but apparently incapable of sustaining for long periods. He wanted a partner who was present, emotionally and physically, in the way that a marriage requires its partners to be present. Emma was capable of presence in short bursts. She was capable of warmth and connection and genuine engagement when those things were useful to her. But she could not maintain them indefinitely, and at some point, probably within the first year of their marriage, perhaps sooner, she began to feel the familiar restlessness. The familiar sense that what she had was not enough. That there was something more, somewhere else, that she was missing by staying here. She left. She separated from Albert without seeking a divorce, without resolving the legal status of their marriage, without doing anything that would have created a clean record of their relationship's end. She simply went. And Albert, left behind, held on to something he probably should have let go of: the hope that she might come back, that the marriage might still be salvaged, that the woman he had married was still, somewhere beneath the departure, the person he believed her to be. That hope kept him connected to Emma long past the point at which the connection served either of them. It kept him from moving on to a life that might have made him happy. It kept him writing letters that she might or might not have wanted to receive. And it eventually led him to Stockton, and a hotel room, and a glass of whiskey, and the end of everything he had hoped for. If you are still awake with me, I want you to take a moment here, not to dwell on the darkness of this story. We will have more of that ahead, but to sit with the particular sadness of Albert McVicker's love. Because there is something worth honoring in the fact that he loved sincerely, that he hoped persistently, that he was, in his way, a faithful person in a faithless situation. He was not a perfect man. No one is a perfect man. But he was a man who gave his love genuinely, and he deserved to have that love received honestly. The world did not give him that. And tonight, in this quiet space, we can at least give him a few minutes of acknowledgement. His name was Albert McVicker. He lived, and he loved, and he died in a hotel room in Stockton, California, on the night of March 23, 1906. He was 40 years old. He had done nothing to deserve what happened to him, and he is worth remembering. There is a moment, in any crime story worth telling, when the focus has to shift from the act itself to the atmosphere around it, the world in which the act became possible, the social context that shaped the people involved, the quiet systemic forces that no individual can easily resist, and that no simple narrative of good and evil can fully account for. This is that moment. To understand Emma Ledoux fully, not to excuse her, but to understand her, you have to understand what it meant to be a woman in the American West in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Not a wealthy woman. Not a woman with family connections and social standing, and the kind of structural support that makes a life manageable even when individual circumstances are difficult. A woman of limited means. A woman without a reliable safety net. A woman whose primary assets, in the social economy of that era, were her physical appearance, her intelligence, and her ability to make herself useful and appealing to the men who controlled access to the resources she needed. This is not a comfortable framing. It is not the kind of framing that the culture of Emma's era would have used, and it is not always the framing that modern culture is entirely comfortable with either, because it risks sounding like an excuse for choices that caused real harm to real people. But it is an honest framing, and honestly is what this story requires. Emma Ledoux was, in important respects, a product of a system that offered women like her very few good options. The domestic ideal, the wife, the mother, the keeper of the hearth, was not an ideal that came with economic security for women who did not marry well, or whose marriages failed, or who found themselves, through circumstance or choice, outside the boundaries of respectable domesticity. A woman who was separated or divorced or widowed in that era and that place was, economically speaking, in a precarious position. She could work, certainly, as a domestic servant, as a seamstress, in a laundry or a hotel, or any of the other female-dominated low-wage occupations that were available to her. But the wages were low, and the security was minimal, and the social status was modest at best. Or she could marry, and if one marriage failed, or ended, or proved insufficient, she could marry again. And if that marriage failed too, she could marry again. And in a world where marriage was the primary mechanism through which women accessed economic security, the incentive to be effective at attracting and managing marriages was not merely personal vanity or romantic instinct. It was survival. Emma had been surviving for a long time before she met Albert McVicker. She had been managing the difficult mathematics of her existence, the balance between what she needed and what was available, between the person she was and the person she needed to appear to be, with considerable skill and very little support. She had learned to be charming because charm was useful. She had learned to be adaptable because adaptability was necessary. She had learned to move on quickly because attachment, in her world, was a luxury she could not always afford. None of this made it acceptable for her to kill Albert McVicker. Nothing makes that acceptable. But it locates the killing within a context that goes beyond the simple story of a bad woman who did a terrible thing, and it asks us to look at the world that produced Emma Ledoux with the same critical attention we bring to Emma Ledoux herself. There were other women like Emma, not women who committed murder. That part was specific to Emma and to whatever was particular in her psychology and her circumstances. But women who moved through multiple marriages, who managed their identities flexibly, who lived at the edges of respectability and used whatever tools were available to maintain themselves in a world that offered them limited formal support. These women are mostly invisible in the historical record because the historical record, as constructed in that era, paid very little attention to women who did not fit neatly into the categories of wife, mother, victim, or criminal. Emma became visible precisely because she crossed into the criminal category in a way that was impossible to ignore. But before that crossing, she was in many respects simply a woman doing what women in her position had to do to get through the years. It is worth sitting with that for a moment, even as we sit with the full knowledge of what she ultimately did. The testimony at Emma's trial painted a picture of a woman who was, in many of the ordinary moments of her life, recognizable and even sympathetic. The witnesses who described her, the hotel staff, the clerks, the doctor, described someone who was polite, composed, and unremarkable in her surface behavior. She said please and thank you. She made her requests clearly and waited for responses calmly. She did not draw unnecessary attention to herself. She was, in the eyes of the people she interacted with in those days around Albert McVicker's death, just a woman going about her business. This is one of the things about Emma Ledoux that the newspapers of 1906 found most disturbing, and that perhaps deserves a slightly different kind of attention than it received. The press framed Emma's composure as evidence of monstrousness. She wasn't appropriately distraught, therefore she was a predator rather than a person. But composure in the face of crisis is not, in itself, evidence of evil. It can be evidence of training, of a lifetime spent managing difficult situations without the luxury of public breakdown. It can be evidence of a particular kind of psychological structure that allows some people to function under pressure in ways that others cannot. It can be evidence of grief so deep it has gone past expression into something numb and internal. Or it can be evidence of a coldness that is genuinely frightening. We do not know, with certainty, which of these explanations fits Emma. We probably cannot know, across a century of distance and the absolute privacy of a dead woman's interior life. What we can do is resist the urge to settle too quickly on any single explanation, because single explanations almost always leave out something important. What the jury decided, after 6 hours, was that whatever Emma's internal state, her external actions constituted first-degree murder, and the law, operating within its own framework and its own definitions, was not wrong about that. Emma did plan. Emma did act deliberately. Emma did kill Albert McVicker. But the law's framework, which is designed to assign individual responsibility for individual acts, is not the only framework available to us as we try to understand a story like this one. And in the quiet of the night, with no verdict to render and no sentence to impose, we can afford to hold the story in a larger frame. A frame that includes the life Emma had before Stockton, the world she moved through, the accumulated weight of years of surviving without support and managing without resources and adapting without end. This is not absolution. This is not a reduction of what she did to anyone else's responsibility. It is simply a more complete picture of a human life, offered in the spirit of honest reflection. Emma Ledoux died in 1941 in a California prison, and the question of what her life means, what it says about the world that shaped her and the choices she made within it and the man she killed and the system that responded to her killing, is not a question that has a clean answer. It is a question we carry forward, imperfectly understood, into our own time and our own reckoning. But there are other parts of Emma's story that we have not yet fully told. There are the years of her imprisonment, the 3.5 decades between her sentencing and her death, and what those years looked like from the inside. There is the question of her paroles, the multiple times she was released, and the circumstances of her returns. There are the people who appear in her story in ways that have not yet been fully examined. Eugene Ledoux, her second husband, who had married a woman without knowing she was already married. Joseph Healy, the young man in San Francisco who believed Emma's account of McVicker's natural death. The doctor who gave her the morphine, and the other men who appear briefly in the margins of her story, drawn in by the same quality that Albert McVicker had been drawn in by. Let us spend some time with these figures. They deserve examination, not just as supporting characters in Emma's story, but as people in their own right whose lives were touched, and in some cases significantly damaged by the trajectory of Emma's choices. Eugene Ledoux, the man Emma had married in 1905, the man whose name she carried when she became famous, occupies a particularly complex position in this story. He was, in the most straightforward sense, a victim of Emma's deception. He had married a woman who was already married to someone else, without any reason to know that this was the case. He had built, or believed he was building, a life with a woman who was simultaneously building a completely different life with another man. When Emma was arrested and the full story of her bigamy became public, Eugene Ledoux was placed in a situation of extraordinary awkwardness and pain. His marriage was not legally valid. The woman he had thought of as his wife was now the subject of a murder investigation. His name was attached to the story in a way that made anonymity impossible. Every newspaper in California knew that Emma Ledoux had been born Emma Cole and had married Eugene Ledoux and had another husband in the form of the murdered Albert McVicker, and the juxtaposition of these facts made Eugene's position in the story unavoidable. What Eugene actually felt about all of this, whether he had loved Emma, whether he had suspected anything, whether he had pieced together, in retrospect, any of the signs that might have suggested she was not who she presented herself to be, is not documented in any great detail. He appears in the public record primarily through the lens of the legal proceedings that followed Emma's arrest, and in those proceedings he is more of a fact to be established than a person to be understood. But he was a person. He had sought out a partner, believed he had found one, and discovered that the woman he had married had another husband alive and was suspected of killing him. He had to live with that discovery in a world where his name was attached to a murder case and his judgment about the person he had married had been publicly demonstrated to be catastrophically wrong. There is a particular kind of pain in that, in learning that you have been deceived in the most fundamental possible way, that the intimacy you believed you shared was built on a fiction, that the person you trusted had been managing you as carefully and instrumentally as she managed everyone else. It is the kind of pain that does not have a clean name and does not find easy resolution. Eugene Ledoux disappears from the public record after Emma's trial. We do not know what became of him. We do not know whether he remarried, whether he found some way to rebuild his life from the ruins of his marriage to Emma, whether he ever fully recovered from the damage that her deceptions had done to his sense of himself and his ability to trust. He simply steps out of the documented story and into the anonymity that most people inhabit, and the historical record moves on without him. Joseph Healy, the young man Emma had encountered in San Francisco after leaving Stockton, had a somewhat less traumatic experience, or at least an experience that left less visible damage. He had believed Emma's account of McVicker's natural death long enough to be associated with her in the press as one of her admirers, which was its own particular kind of public embarrassment. But he had not been charged with anything, had not been found complicit in anything, and appears to have extricated himself from the situation without permanent legal consequence. Still, there is something in his story worth pausing on. He was a young man who had been charmed by Emma in the immediate aftermath of a murder, who had believed a lie told by a woman who had just committed that murder, and who had been, for a brief period, the unknowing companion of someone who was already being hunted across the state of California. The experience of learning the truth, of reading the newspaper and understanding what the woman sitting across from him had done, must have been its own particular kind of shock. The doctor who prescribed the morphine carried his own weight in this story. He had done nothing wrong under the standards of his profession. A patient had presented with what appeared to be a legitimate request for medication, and he had provided it. He had no way of knowing what the medication would be used for. He had no mechanism for detecting the plan that was unfolding just outside the frame of his professional interaction with Emma. He had simply done what doctors do, and in doing so had inadvertently provided the instrument of a man's death. This is the kind of knowledge that settles into a person and does not leave easily. The doctor had treated Albert McVicker and had believed him to be recovering. And then, a short time later, he had given the woman who was McVicker's wife a prescription for the drug that killed him. The combination of those two facts, the innocent treatment followed by the inadvertent provision of the murder weapon, must have been extraordinarily difficult to sit with, regardless of whether he carried any legal responsibility for the outcome. He didn't carry legal responsibility. He was a witness, not a defendant. He testified, and he told the truth, and the truth he told was part of what put Emma in prison for life. But his role in the chain of events that led to McVicker's death is a reminder that terrible things rarely happen in isolation, rarely result from a single person's actions, and always involve a wider web of ordinary people doing ordinary things that somehow contribute to an extraordinary outcome. This is one of the things that true crime as a genre can do well when it chooses to, not just tell the story of the criminal or the victim, but illuminate the web. All the ordinary people who were present in their ordinary ways when something extraordinary happened. The clerk who sold the rope, the merchant who delivered the trunk, the baggage workers who moved it and smelled it and opened it, the hotel staff who saw Emma in the corridor and noticed nothing wrong, the telegraph operators who relayed her description across the state. Each of them was a thread in the story. Each of them was a person with their own life and their own concerns, who happened to be standing in a particular place at a particular moment and found themselves woven into something much larger and darker than their ordinary Tuesday. That web is part of what we mean when we say that crime does not happen in a vacuum. Every crime is, in some sense, a social event, a thing that happens within a community, involving a community, leaving traces in a community that last long after the formal resolution of the legal case. Stockton, California, in 1906 was changed by Emma Ledoux and what she did there. The hotel where she and McVicker stayed became a landmark in the morbid geography of local history. The train depot acquired a dimension it had not had before. The town's sense of itself, its sense of what could happen here, in our streets, in our hotels, between people who presented themselves as ordinary, was shifted permanently by the knowledge of what had happened. Communities remember. They hold the memories of violent events and the place names and the local histories and the accumulated consciousness of people who were told the story by people who were told the story by people who were there. The story of the trunk at the Stockton Depot is still told in that part of California, still known, still alive in the way that particularly vivid local history stays alive. And in a museum somewhere in California, the trunk sits, waiting to be looked at, carrying, in its silent, physical way, the full weight of everything that passed through it. The years that Emma Ledoux spent inside California's prison system were years that the state was also, in its own slow institutional way, changing. The early 20th century brought with it a gradual, fitful movement toward what reformers of the era called scientific penology, the idea that prisons should not simply punish but should also, in some measurable way, rehabilitate. That the people held within them should not simply be contained but should be studied, understood, and if possible redirected toward lives of productive, law-abiding citizenship after their release. This was an idealistic vision, and like most idealistic visions, it encountered the resistance of institutional inertia and inadequate funding and the sheer complexity of actually managing large populations of people in confined spaces. But the reform movement was real, and it produced changes in the classification of prisoners, in the conditions of confinement, in the development of work programs and educational opportunities that had not existed in earlier decades. Emma, serving her life sentence, was in a position to observe these changes from within. She was, by the accounts that survive, a participant in the work programs that were available to her. She was noted, in the official records, as a cooperative prisoner. Not warm. Warmth toward institutional authority was not something Emma was ever likely to cultivate for its own sake, but cooperative. Functional. The kind of prisoner who did not create problems and who, over long years, generated the kind of institutional record that could support a parole application. The first parole came, as we have noted, sometime in the 1920s. Emma would have been in her late 40s or early 50s at this point, an age that, in combination with the years of incarceration and the passage of time since her crime, made her considerably less alarming as a figure than she had been in 1906. The woman who was paroled in the 1920s was not the woman the California press had called the trunk murderess. She was an older woman, gray perhaps, quieter certainly, shaped by 15 or more years of institutional life in ways that were physically visible and probably psychologically deep. What Emma did with her first period of freedom outside the prison walls is not clearly documented. She would have been placed under specific conditions, required to report to a parole officer, restricted in her movement, prohibited from certain behaviors or associations. Parole in that era was a structured supervision, not simply a release, and the conditions attached to it were serious. Violating them, as Emma did, meant return to prison. What kind of violation sent her back is not specified in the records that are available. It may have been something as relatively minor as a failure to report, a movement outside her permitted geographic range, an association with individuals she was prohibited from seeing. It may have been something more serious. Without the specific documentation, we cannot say. What we can say is that the pattern of release and return, the parole, the violation, the return to prison, suggests something important about Emma's relationship with the constraints of institutional life. She was capable of managing those constraints when the walls were literal and the options were clear. But when the walls came down and the world opened up, Emma appears to have struggled with the conditions attached to her freedom. She was, fundamentally, a woman who operated according to her own internal calculus rather than external rules, and that quality, which had served her in some ways during her years of surviving on the margins, made the compliance requirements of parole a persistent source of difficulty. There is, in this pattern, a kind of tragedy that is separate from the tragedy of McVicker's death and Emma's conviction. It is the tragedy of a woman who had enough self-possession to survive decades of imprisonment, but not quite enough flexibility to successfully navigate the conditional freedom that was intermittently offered to her. Each violation meant a return to the walls. Each return meant more years of the institutional life that was, at some level, easier for Emma to manage than the complex, conditional life outside. Or perhaps that is too simple. Perhaps the violations were not about difficulty with freedom, but about specific choices Emma kept making. Choices that reflected the same quality that had defined her life before Stockton. The unwillingness to be entirely contained by other people's rules. The insistence on her own reading of a situation over the official reading. The fundamental Emma-ness of Emma, which had survived the decades in prison intact enough to keep getting her into trouble. She was in her 60s when she died in 1941. 66 years old, by the most commonly cited account. She had entered the prison system as a woman in her early 30s, which means she spent roughly 35 years, more than half of her adult life, in confinement. The California of 1941 was almost unrecognizable from the California of 1906. The state had more than doubled in population. Cities had grown massive. The automobile had replaced the horse and the railroad as the primary mode of individual transportation. The social and cultural landscape had been remade repeatedly by depression and war and technological change that Emma, from within her institutional world, had witnessed only at a distance, filtered through newspapers and the accounts of visitors and guards. Did Emma Ledoux regret what she had done? Did she, in the long years of her imprisonment, think about Albert McVicker, about the man he had been, about the nights in the hotel room in Stockton, about the choice she had made and its consequences? Did she ever fully confront, in the private darkness of her cell, the reality of what she had taken from him? We do not know. The internal life of Emma Ledoux in the decades of her imprisonment is not documented in any way that would allow us to answer these questions with confidence. The glimpses we have, the official records, the few surviving fragments of correspondence, the accounts of prison officials, give us the external Emma, but not the internal one. They tell us what she did, and with whom she interacted, and how she was assessed by the people responsible for managing her. They do not tell us what she felt. This is perhaps appropriate. The inner life is the one thing that cannot be taken away, the one space that remains private even in the most total form of institutional confinement. Whatever Emma carried inside herself through those 35 years, whatever grief, whatever justification, whatever distance or closeness she maintained from the memory of what she had done, was hers alone, and it died with her in 1941, taking whatever answers it held into the silence beyond reach. What we are left with is the shape of her life as it appears from outside. A woman who was born in California in 1875, who moved through the world with great energy and considerable intelligence, and a fundamental willingness to transgress whatever boundaries stood between her and what she wanted, who killed a man in 1906 in a hotel room in Stockton, who was tried and convicted and spent the remaining decades of her life in prison, and who died there, old and quiet, in a world that had moved so far past the events of her notoriety that the people around her in those final years may barely have known her name. But before we close tonight, and we are moving toward the close of this part of the story, though there is still much more to explore, I want to sit with something that I think is easy to overlook in the telling of stories like this one. The stories we tell about crime, about the people who commit it and the people who are harmed by it and the institutions that respond to it, shape the way we see the world. They shape what we think people are capable of. They shape what we think we are capable of in our better and worse moments. They shape our assumptions about women and men, about trust and deception, about love and its limits. Emma Ledoux's story has been told, over the decades, primarily as a horror story. A cautionary tale. A story about a woman who was so different from ordinary women, so far outside the range of normal human behavior, that she could serve as a kind of fixed point, a marker for the outermost reaches of feminine evil, the extreme end of a spectrum that normal women could locate themselves reassuringly far from. But I want to suggest a different reading. Not a comfortable reading, and not one that diminishes what Emma did, but a reading that sees Emma Ledoux as a human being who was, in many respects, not so different from the rest of us as the monster narrative requires. A person who wanted security, who wanted freedom, who wanted to be something more than the circumstances of her birth had prepared her for. A person who made choices, some comprehensible, some terrible, within the constraints of a world that offered her very limited options. A person whose capacity for harm existed alongside a genuine human interiority that we will never fully access and that the monster narrative, by design, refuses to acknowledge. This is not a redemption story. Emma Ledoux was not redeemed. Albert McVicker was not brought back. The harm that was done cannot be undone by any reframing of the person who did it. But it is a fuller story. And fuller stories, even when they are darker and more complicated and harder to hold, are the ones that actually teach us something about the world we live in. If you are still awake, I want to ask you something. Not a dramatic question, not a cliffhanger, just a genuine question offered in the quiet of this late hour. When you think about the choices Emma made, not the murder, but the earlier ones, the smaller ones, the accumulating series of decisions that led her from Amador County to Stockton, what do you think about? What do they make you think about in your own life? About the choices you have made or might have made under different circumstances? About the distance between the person you are and the person you might be if the world had pressed you differently? These are not questions I can answer for you. They are questions for the quiet moments before sleep, when the guard of the conscious mind is loosening and something more honest is available. I will leave them with you. And now I want to take us back into the story, back into some of the details we haven't fully explored yet. The bigamy, the insurance, the full shape of Emma's double life in the years leading up to McVicker's death. Because there is still more to understand, more thread to follow, before we arrive at whatever conclusions are available to us at the end of this long, dark road. Before we do, if this story has been keeping you company tonight, if the voice has been a comfort in whatever hour this finds you, please hit the like button and make sure you're subscribed to the channel. We tell these stories with care, and knowing you are here, wherever in the world you are, is what makes this work worthwhile. Drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. Now, back to Emma. Back to the years before Stockton, when the trap was being constructed one careful piece at a time. The bigamy that sat at the center of Emma Ledoux's story is perhaps the least sensational element of her history, and yet in some ways, it is the most revealing. Because bigamy, the maintenance of two simultaneous marriages without either spouse knowing about the other, requires a particular quality that the more dramatic crimes of Emma's story can sometimes obscure. It requires sustained management. It requires the daily work of maintaining two separate versions of a life, keeping them from colliding, ensuring that the people in each version remain unaware of the other's existence. It requires, above all, an extraordinary capacity for compartmentalization, the ability to move between two completely different identities without allowing one to contaminate the other. Emma had been building this capacity for years before she married Eugene Ledoux. She had been practicing it in smaller ways, in the personas she adopted in different towns, in the names she used and discarded, in the selective truths she told, and the convenient omissions she maintained. By the time she acquired her second simultaneous husband, she had, in a sense, been training for it for a decade. The marriage to Eugene Ledoux in 1905 was, from Emma's perspective, a specific solution to a specific problem. She needed resources. She needed stability, or the appearance of stability. She needed the social legitimacy that marriage provided to women in that era, the cover of wifehood, the respectability that attached to a woman who was married to a working man and living the ordinary life of a domestic partnership. She needed, in short, a husband. The fact that she already had one was, to Emma, apparently a manageable inconvenience rather than an insurmountable obstacle. She had already demonstrated, in her management of William Williams' death and her movement through various towns and identities, that the legal and social strictures that governed other people's lives were not, in her personal accounting, absolute. They were constraints to be worked around, rules to be selectively honored, lines to be respected only when crossing them would create more problems than it solved. Marrying Eugene Ledoux while still technically married to Albert McVicker crossed one of those lines. But from Emma's vantage point, it was a manageable crossing. Albert was far away. Albert was not part of her daily life. Albert existed, for practical purposes, as a problem from her past rather than a presence in her present. The marriage on paper was, she may have told herself, a formality, a technicality, the loose end of a chapter she had already moved beyond. Eugene, who knew nothing of Albert's existence, would not be harmed by something he didn't know about. This is the reasoning of a person who has learned to prioritize her own needs so completely that the interests and rights of others have become secondary considerations. It is not a reasoning process that most people would endorse, but it is a recognizable one. We all, to varying degrees, manage the cognitive load of our moral life by telling stories that make our choices seem more defensible than a purely objective view would allow. Emma's version of this universal human tendency was simply more extreme, more persistent, and more consequential than most. The problem arrived when Albert McVicker refused to stay in the past where Emma had placed him. His outreach, his letters, his insistence on contact was, from a certain perspective, simply a man trying to maintain a connection with a woman he still cared about. It was not aggressive. It was not threatening, in any conventional sense. He was not blackmailing her. He was not threatening to expose her bigamy to the authorities or to Eugene Ledoux. He was, as best we can tell from the evidence, simply a man who had not stopped loving his wife and who wanted to see her. But Emma's calculus was not about aggression or threat in any simple sense. It was about risk. Albert's continued presence in her life was a risk, a variable she could not control, a person whose knowledge of her history made him dangerous simply by existing. He knew she had remarried. He may have known she had not divorced him. He had enough information, if he chose to use it, to dismantle everything she had built with Eugene Ledoux. This is the fundamental logic that appears to have driven Emma toward the decision she made on the night of March 23, 1906. Not hatred of Albert McVicker, not a need for revenge or the expression of some deep personal grievance. Something colder and more pragmatic than that. The calculation that his continued existence represented a risk she could not mitigate by any means other than the most permanent one. It is worth noting, because it is important to the full picture, that this calculation was wrong on its own terms. Even setting aside the profound moral wrongness of killing another human being, Emma's plan was operationally flawed from the beginning. The evidence she left behind, the prescription, the rope, the trunk, the witnesses who could place her at each stage of the chain, was more than sufficient to convict her. The baggage tag mistake simply accelerated a discovery that would likely have occurred by some other means eventually. Emma was not, despite her considerable intelligence, executing a plan that could have succeeded in the long term. She was, in those days in Stockton, operating under the kind of tunnel vision that extreme stress and fear sometimes produce. The narrowing of attention onto a single problem, the single solution, the failure to fully account for the downstream consequences of the chosen action. She was so focused on the problem of Albert McVicker that she apparently failed to adequately consider the problem of what happens after Albert McVicker. The investigation, the witnesses, the physical evidence, the inescapable trace that a human death in a hotel room leaves behind. Or perhaps she did consider those things and simply underestimated them. Perhaps she overestimated her ability to manage the aftermath, the way she had managed so many other difficult things in her life. Perhaps she believed that her composure, her practiced invisibility, her capacity to present the right face to the right person at the right moment, would be sufficient to carry her through even this. It was not. The story of Emma Ledoux's trial, which we have covered in its broad outlines already, contains, in its details, a portrait of a woman whose control was slowly, publicly, systematically stripped away as the prosecution presented its case. Each witness, each piece of evidence, each carefully assembled link in the chain was another removal of the careful construction she had built. The Joe Miller story, told with apparent conviction in the early stages of the defense, was taken apart piece by piece until nothing remained of it but the naked fact of its fabrication. Emma's composure in the courtroom, so frequently noted and so frequently cited as evidence of her cold nature, can also be read as the composure of a person watching the dismantling of something they spent years constructing and having no remaining mechanism to stop it. She could not lie her way out of this the way she had lied her way out of other situations. She could not move to a new town and become someone new. She could not pour a drink and dissolve the problem into it. All she could do was sit and compose herself and watch. And then, when it was finally and irreversibly over, she could write the letter that said, "Guilty." The letter is one of the most interesting documents in Emma Ledoux's story, precisely because of how little it contains. It does not explain. It does not elaborate. It does not offer the kind of extended justification or contextualization that a person who has maintained their innocence for months might be expected to produce when finally acknowledging their guilt. It simply states the decision, the guilty plea, the end of the contest, with the same economy of expression that Emma appears to have brought to everything. What does such a letter feel like to write? Not in the legal sense, but in the human sense. The moment of putting down the fiction you have been carrying and acknowledging, on paper, to the people who have the power to determine what remains of your life, that what they believe about you is true. We can't know. We can only imagine. And imagination, in this context, is necessarily partial. We carry our own emotional frames and our own assumptions about guilt and regret and self-knowledge into any attempt to inhabit another person's moment of reckoning. What we can say is that after the letter, Emma Ledoux's public story effectively ended. The trial was resolved. The sentence was pronounced. The newspapers moved on. The great wave of public attention that had swept over her life in 1906 and 1907 gradually subsided, and Emma became, for the remaining decades of her life, simply a prisoner serving a life sentence. One entry among many in the records of the California prison system. The public, which had been so fascinated by her, moved on to other fascinations. California continued to grow and change. New scandals arose to command attention. The trunk murderess became a historical footnote, vivid and specific when recalled, but increasingly distant from the present concerns of a state that was perpetually generating new stories, new disasters, new figures to fix the public gaze upon. Emma receded, but she did not disappear entirely. She remained, stubbornly, physically present in the world, an old woman in a California prison, doing the work assigned to her, following the rules as closely as she could manage, existing in the reduced and carefully managed life that incarceration permitted. And the trunk in the museum continued to exist. A wooden box, waiting. This is, perhaps, the appropriate note on which to begin moving toward the close of this story, not because the story is exhausted, but because we have reached the point at which the remaining threads lead not to new revelations, but to the gradual settling of understanding into place. What do we know after all of this? We know that Emma Ledoux was a complicated human being who made terrible choices that caused irreparable harm to at least one person and possibly more. We know that she lived and moved through a world that shaped her in specific ways and offered her specific options. We know that she was, in many of her ordinary moments, a person capable of warmth and social connection and the kind of practical intelligence that makes a person effective in the world. We know that she was also capable of something much darker, the cold calculation that identified a human being as a problem and solved the problem in the most absolute way available. We know that Albert McVicker loved her and died for it. We know that the legal system responded to her crime with a severity unprecedented for a woman in California and then moderated that severity through the appellate process. We know that she spent the better part of 4 decades in prison and that the California she entered in 1906 and the California she died in 1941 were separated by an almost inconceivable distance in every respect except the physical geography. And we know, because the trunk in the museum insists on it, that the material traces of what happened in Stockton in March of 1906 have outlasted everyone involved. The trunk is still there. The record is still there. The story is still there. We are here, tonight, still telling it. And in the telling, careful, honest, as full and as fair as we can make it. We are doing what stories can do at their best, making present something that has passed, honoring the people who were hurt, and asking, quietly and persistently, the questions that don't have easy answers. What makes a person dangerous? What makes a person capable of crossing the line that most of us will never cross? Between thinking something and doing it, between anger and violence, between calculation and murder. What does it take? And what does it mean? These are questions for the rest of the night, and the nights after it, and all the ordinary days in between. For now, take a breath. Settle deeper into wherever you are resting. We are going to continue in a moment, going deeper into some of the threads we have not yet fully followed. But first, if this story has been worth your time tonight, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your engagement is what makes it possible to keep bringing you stories told this way, carefully, with respect for the people involved and for the people listening. We are grateful you are here. There are certain questions that surface in any telling of Emma Ledoux's story that deserve more sustained attention than the broader narrative structure usually allows. These are the gaps, the places where the historical record thins out or goes silent, where the official documents end and the human reality continues in a darkness we cannot entirely illuminate. They are the questions that the newspapers of 1906 asked with sensationalism, and that we can ask tonight with the quieter intention of genuine inquiry. The first and perhaps most persistent of these questions is the one about William Williams, Emma's second husband, the man she had married in Arizona, the man who had died and left her with an insurance payment, exists in the historical record in a state of permanent ambiguity. He died. The circumstances of his death were, at the time, accepted as natural. There was no investigation in the way that McVicker's death was eventually investigated. There was no trunk, no dramatic discovery, no sequence of purchases and movements that could be traced back to a plan. There was simply a man who became ill and a woman who collected on his insurance policy and moved on. The investigators who worked on the McVicker case were aware of Williams. The prosecution attempted, in the trial, to introduce his death as evidence of a pattern, to suggest that McVicker was not Emma's first victim, that what had happened in the Stockton hotel was not an anomaly but a repetition, the second instance of something she had done before. The court, applying the evidentiary rules of 1906, was not fully receptive to this argument. There was simply not enough concrete evidence about Williams' death to use it in the legal proceedings against Emma, without prejudicing the jury in a way that the defense could challenge. But outside the courtroom, in the newspapers, and in the public consciousness, the Williams question was very much alive. The people who covered Emma's story in the press were not constrained by evidentiary standards. They could speculate. They could suggest. They could frame Williams' death in the context of Emma's subsequent behavior and invite their readers to draw the obvious conclusion. The obvious conclusion was that Emma had killed him, that the morphine that killed Albert McVicker in 1906 was not the first time Emma had used a substance to end a husband's life, that the insurance money she collected on Williams was the profit of murder, just as, or so the prosecution argued, the freedom she sought to protect in 1906 was the motive for another. We cannot prove this. We have to say that clearly and repeatedly, because the difference between "we strongly suspect" and "we know" is one of the most important distinctions in any attempt at honest storytelling about real people and real events. The truth is that Williams' death cannot be definitively attributed to Emma LeDoux based on the evidence that survives. The suspicion is reasonable, given the pattern. The conclusion is not provable. But suspicion does not require proof in order to be significant. The fact that it is reasonable to suspect Emma of killing Williams tells us something about the shape of her life and the pattern of her behavior. It tells us that whatever happened in Stockton in March of 1906 was not, in all likelihood, an isolated event produced by a unique set of circumstances. It tells us that the capacity Emma demonstrated in that hotel room, the capacity to see a human being as a problem to be solved rather than a person to be respected, had probably been present for longer than anyone knew. The second great question in Emma's story is the question of what, exactly, happened in that hotel room on the night of March 23, 1906. We know the broad outlines. We know that morphine was administered. We know that Albert McVicker died. We know that his body was subsequently placed in a trunk. But the specific sequence of events, the exact timeline, the precise actions that were taken in what order, the final moments of Albert McVicker's life, these are not fully documented. The physical evidence that investigators found in the hotel room gave them information about the outcome, but the process remained partially obscured. The investigators believed, based on their examination of McVicker's body and the condition of the hotel room, that Emma may have taken actions beyond the morphine dosing to ensure McVicker's death. The morphine was administered. He lost consciousness. But investigators concluded that he may not have been dead when Emma began her subsequent preparations, that there may have been a period of time, after the morphine had done its initial work, when McVicker was unconscious but not yet dead, and that Emma's actions during that period may have been more directly violent than simply waiting for the drug to complete its work. This is difficult to contemplate. It requires us to stay with the reality of what happened rather than the abstracted version, to understand that Albert McVicker's death was not instantaneous, was not painless, was not something he experienced as a simple fading away from consciousness into peaceful oblivion. It was a process. It took time. And the person who had set that process in motion was present throughout. We move quickly past this part of the story because it is very hard to hold. But it is part of the truth of what happened in that room, and the full truth deserves acknowledgement, even in the most carefully modulated form. The third question in Emma's story is the one about the furniture. This detail appears briefly in the accounts of her planning and execution of the crime, and it is the kind of detail that lodges in the mind because of what it reveals about the state of Emma's thinking in those days in Stockton. While Albert McVicker was alive, while he was resting in the hotel room, while he believed they were reconciling, Emma was elsewhere in the city, attending to other business. Specifically, she and McVicker had gone together to purchase furniture. Emma had told him they would be moving to her mother's farm, that they needed to furnish the place. They had picked out pieces together, the way a couple might, standing side by side in a furniture store and choosing the things that would fill the shared space they were supposedly about to inhabit. Emma had arranged for the furniture to be shipped to Eugene Ledoux, her other husband. She had given the shipping address of the man she was planning to return to once she had dealt with the man standing next to her in the furniture store. She had, in the course of the same days during which she was planning to kill Albert McVicker, been simultaneously managing the domestic details of the other life she intended to return to. She had been, in effect, doing both things at once: the reconciliation and the murder, the performance of a future with McVicker, and the actual preparation for a future without him. With the same focused efficiency she brought to everything. The furniture that was purchased for Emma's supposed future with Albert McVicker was shipped to the address of the husband who didn't know he had a wife who was currently occupied with murdering the previous one. This detail, more than almost any other in the story, captures the specific quality of Emma's inner organization. The ability to hold two completely contradictory realities simultaneously, to perform one for the benefit of an observer while executing the other, is a quality that appears throughout her story, in the management of her bigamy, in her presentation of a grieving wife while the police investigated her husband's death, in the composed performance of a concerned woman seeking a doctor's help even as she was obtaining the instrument of murder. It is not a quality we can easily admire, but it is a quality we should perhaps try to understand, because it is not alien. It is a more extreme version of the kind of internal compartmentalization that all human beings engage in to some degree. We manage different personas for different contexts. We perform emotions we don't entirely feel. We tell stories about ourselves that are more flattering or more coherent than the raw material of our actual lives. Emma's version of this universal human capacity was amplified to a degree that made it pathological, but its roots are recognizably human. The fourth and perhaps most interesting unanswered question in Emma's story is the question of what she hoped for after. After McVicker was dead, after the trunk was at the depot, after she was on the train to San Francisco, and then to wherever her next stop would be. What did Emma Ledoux believe her future looked like? What did she think would happen? She must have known the plan was imperfect. She must have known, on some level, that a body in a trunk at a railroad depot was not a problem that would simply disappear because she wanted it to. She was intelligent enough to understand that detection was possible, perhaps probable, and yet she proceeded. And yet she left Stockton with the particular calm that multiple witnesses described. Was there a plan beyond the plan? A version of the future in which the trunk arrived at its destination without being opened, in which the evidence dissolved, in which Emma returned to Eugene Ledoux with a clean slate and a story about her first husband's natural death and a furniture delivery she could explain with a convenient fiction. Was there, in Emma's mind, a realistic picture of the life she was trying to protect, and did it sustain her through those terrible nights? Or was the plan not really about the future at all? Was it about the present, about the immediate, urgent need to resolve the threat that Albert McVicker represented, regardless of what happened afterward? Was it, in some fundamental way, about a woman who had been managing crises reactively for so long that the long view had simply ceased to be available to her? These questions do not have answers. They are the questions we hold in the dark, in the small hours, when the story has been told as fully as it can be told, and what remains is the silence of things we will never know. Let us sit with that silence for a moment. The world that produced Emma Ledoux, the California of the late 19th century, the transient communities of the mining country and the desert Southwest, the informal economies and the limited options, and the social pressures that shaped the lives of women who found themselves outside the boundaries of respectable domesticity. That world is gone. It is gone in most of its material particulars, though its echoes persist in the cultural DNA of the West, in the mythology of reinvention and mobility that still defines the region's self-understanding. Emma Ledoux herself is gone. Albert McVicker is gone. William Williams is gone. Eugene Ledoux is gone. The doctor, the clerks, the baggage workers, the jurors, Judge Nutter, all gone. The hotel where Emma and Albert checked in as Mr. and Mrs. McVicker is gone. The Stockton of 1906 is almost entirely gone, replaced by the Stockton of the present, which has its own stories and its own griefs and its own complicated history. What remains is the trunk, the records, This story, and the questions. The questions remain, as questions always do, outlasting everything else. Outlasting the people who first asked them and the people they were asked about, and the world in which the events that prompted them occurred. The questions persist because they point to something that is not historical, not specific to one time and one place, but permanent and human and endlessly relevant. What are we capable of under sufficient pressure? What are the limits we believe we would not cross? And how certain are we about those beliefs? What is the difference between the person we are and the person we might become in circumstances we can't predict and haven't prepared for? Emma Ledoux believed she knew her own limits. She had navigated the world for 30 years on the strength of that self-knowledge, or what she took for self-knowledge. And then she found herself in a hotel room in Stockton in March of 1906, with an unconscious man on the bed and a plan she had spent days constructing, and she discovered that her limits were not where she had thought they were. Or perhaps she discovered, and this is the darker possibility, that they were exactly where she had always known they were. That nothing about what she did in that room surprised her. That the person who stood there in the lamplight of a California hotel, in the early hours of March 24th, 1906, was the same person who had always been there, making the same kind of calculations, following the same internal logic, just further down the road than she had ever gone before. We cannot answer that. Only Emma could answer it. And Emma is gone. But the question is worth asking. And asking it, in the dark, in the honest privacy of the small hours, is perhaps the most useful thing we can do with a story like this one. We have come now to the place in Emma Ledoux's story where the immediate drama, the murder, the discovery, the flight, the arrest, the trial, has been fully told. What remains is to sit with the aftermath. Not just the immediate aftermath that we have already traced, the conviction, the overturned verdict, the guilty plea, the life sentence, but the longer, slower aftermath. The decades, the years of incarceration, the changing world outside the prison walls, the gradual fading of a famous name into historical obscurity. And there is one more dimension of this story that deserves careful attention before we begin to move toward the close. The question of what the Emma Ledoux case did to the world around it. Not just to the individuals directly involved. The people we have already discussed, Eugene Ledoux and Joseph Healy and the doctor and the baggage workers and all the others, but to the broader cultural and legal landscape of California and, in some degree, the country. Because Emma Ledoux's case arrived at a particular moment in American legal and cultural history. The early 20th century was a period during which questions about women, about their nature, their capabilities, their capacity for violence, their proper place in the legal system, were being actively contested in ways that had not been true in earlier eras. The women's suffrage movement was gaining momentum. The first women were beginning to enter professional life in law and medicine and other fields that had previously been entirely male. The cultural conversation about what women were and what they were capable of was in flux. Into this context, Emma Ledoux dropped like a stone into still water. The ripples she created went in several directions at once. On one side, her case was used by those who were alarmed by the prospect of female autonomy to argue that women were, in fact, capable of the full range of human wickedness, that the assumption of female gentleness and moral superiority that had been used to argue for women's suffrage was naive at best and dangerously misleading at worst. If Emma Ledoux could plan and execute a murder with the cold efficiency she had demonstrated, then what exactly was the basis for treating women as morally elevated beings who deserved an expanded role in civic life? This argument was made, in various forms, by various commentators in the press coverage of Emma's case. It was not always made explicitly, but it ran beneath much of the reporting and editorial commentary as an undercurrent. The suggestion that Emma's case demonstrated something essential about the nature of women that the suffragists preferred not to acknowledge. On the other side, more progressive commentators used Emma's case to argue something different. They noted that the circumstances of Emma's life, the limited options, the economic precarity, the dependence on marriage as a survival mechanism, were the product of a social system that denied women economic independence and civic equality. Emma had not been born dangerous. She had been shaped into someone capable of dangerous acts by a world that offered her very little in the way of legitimate paths to the security and agency she sought. The answer was not to continue treating women as wards of a paternalistic social order, but to give them the tools, the education, the economic opportunity, the legal standing, to navigate the world without the desperate improvisation that Emma's life had required. These arguments were not settled by Emma's case, of course. They were part of a much larger conversation that would continue for decades, and that, in many respects, continues today. But Emma Ledoux's story gave that conversation a vivid, concrete, undeniably dramatic example to anchor itself to, and it was cited, argued over, and interpreted from multiple directions throughout the decade following her conviction. Her case also had more direct legal effects. The fact that she had been sentenced to death, the first woman in California to receive that sentence, focused attention on the question of whether the death penalty should apply to women in the same way it applied to men. This question did not produce immediate legislative change, but it contributed to a longer-term conversation about gender and punishment that would eventually influence California law. The case also contributed to ongoing discussions about bigamy law, its enforcement, its adequacy as a protection for the rights of spouses who were deceived, and the practical difficulty of detecting and prosecuting it in a mobile, record-sparse society. Emma had maintained 2 marriages simultaneously for approximately a year, without any official entity becoming aware of the situation. This was not unusual. Bigamy was more common in that era than official records suggested, precisely because the mechanisms for detection were so limited. The press coverage of Emma's case included extensive discussion of this problem, and while it did not produce immediate legislative response, it added to the accumulating case for better record-keeping and interjurisdictional cooperation in the tracking of vital records. More broadly, the Emma Ledoux case was part of a moment in American true crime history when the public fascination with female criminals was reaching one of its periodic peaks. The early 20th century saw several high-profile cases involving women accused of murder. Cases that commanded enormous press attention and generated intense public debate about the nature of female criminality, the adequacy of the legal system's response to it, and the cultural meanings to be drawn from it. Emma was part of this moment. She was, in some ways, its defining California example. The trunk murderess, the name that captured both the method and the gender in a single vivid phrase, became a reference point in discussions of female criminality that extended well beyond California's borders. She was discussed in newspapers from New York to London. She was cited in academic articles about criminal psychology. She was used as an example, variously, of the corrupting effects of a depraved environment on female nature, the consequences of insufficient female education, the dangers of bigamy law's inadequate enforcement, and the fundamental mystery of a woman's capacity for violence that Victorian and Edwardian culture found so disturbing and so compelling. None of these uses of Emma's story were particularly interested in Emma herself, in the specific person, with her specific history and her specific psychology and her specific experience of the specific world she had moved through. They were interested in Emma as a symbol, a case study, an illustration of whatever point the person deploying her story needed to make. This is what happens to people who become famous for their crimes. They lose their particularity and become representative, standing in for something larger than themselves, their actual human complexity flattened into whatever shape the cultural moment requires. Emma herself, sitting in her California prison cell, had no control over these uses of her story. She could not respond to the editorials. She could not correct the interpretations she found inaccurate. She could not insist on her complexity in the face of a culture's determined reductionism. She was, once she had been convicted and sentenced, simply the trunk murderess, a fixed name attached to a fixed story, circulating through the culture with the independent life that stories acquire once they escape the control of the people they are about. This, too, is part of what it means to become the subject of a crime story. You lose control of your narrative. You become available for other people's purposes. Your life, its specific texture, its honest complexity, its actual dimension, gets replaced by the version that is useful, that is dramatic, that serves the cultural needs of the moment. And the replacement is so thorough, so pervasive, so reinforced by repetition across decades of retelling, that the original becomes difficult to access even for people who are genuinely trying to find it. We have been trying, tonight, to find it. To get past the headline and the name and the dramatic image of a trunk in a railroad depot and find the actual person. Complicated, damaged, capable of terrible acts, and also of the ordinary human qualities that make terrible acts comprehensible rather than simply monstrous. We have not entirely succeeded. We cannot entirely succeed. The distance is too great, the record too incomplete, the private dimensions of Emma's inner life too thoroughly inaccessible across a century of time. But we have tried. And the trying matters, not because it changes what Emma did or what happened to Albert McVicker, but because honest engagement with the full complexity of human stories is how we actually learn from them, as opposed to simply being shocked by them and moving on. The trunk in the museum is still there. It has been there for over 100 years. People visit it. They look at it. They try to imagine. They bring to it whatever they bring to encounters with the physical residue of terrible events. Curiosity, horror, sadness, the particular kind of thoughtfulness that close contact with mortality can produce. What do you feel if you imagine standing in front of it? What does the trunk, this ordinary object made extraordinary by what it once contained, make you think about? About Emma? About Albert? About the hotel room and the whiskey and the morphine and the March night in Stockton when everything converged into a single, irreversible act? Or about something more general? About the capacity for harm that exists in the human heart. Not just in Emma's heart. Not just in the hearts of the people history identifies as criminals, but in the ordinary, imperfect, pressure-tested hearts of everyone who has ever wanted something badly enough to consider doing something they should not have. The trunk holds all of these questions. It holds them patiently, without judgment, with the simple, enduring solidity of a thing that has outlasted its moment and continues to exist in the world's patient attention. We should be as patient as the trunk. We should sit with these questions as long as they need to be sat with, and not rush toward the easy answers that would let us close the story and move on without being changed by it. But we are moving toward the close of this particular telling. The night is long, and so is the story, and we have now covered its main dimensions: the crime, the investigation, the trial, the sentence, the appeals, the guilty plea, the life in prison, the death, the long cultural aftermath, and the questions that survive all of it. What remains is to gather those threads together, not to tie them off neatly, because they don't tie off neatly, but to hold them, all at once, and feel the full weight of the story they collectively make. That is what we will do now. Let us return, one more time, to the morning of March 24th, 1906. Not to rehearse the discovery. We have been there already. We have stood with the baggage workers and watched the trunk opened in the lamplight. But to imagine the city around that discovery. To imagine Stockton waking up to an ordinary spring morning, entirely unaware that in the baggage room of its railroad depot, a story was already unfolding that would make its name known across California and beyond. The streets of Stockton that morning were full of ordinary life. People going to work. Wagons moving through the streets with their loads of agricultural produce. The lifeblood of a riverport city whose economy was built on the wealth of the Central Valley. Children on their way to school. Women managing their domestic errands. Men at their counters and their jobs, navigating the ordinary Tuesday of their ordinary lives. In the depot baggage room, the smell was getting worse. And somewhere in that city, or perhaps already on a train moving west toward San Francisco, Emma Ledoux was also conducting the business of an ordinary morning. She had slept or not slept. She had risen and dressed with whatever she had brought with her to Stockton. She had eaten or not eaten. She had made her way out of the hotel where the room she and Albert McVicker had shared was still waiting to be examined by investigators who did not yet know it needed to be examined, and into the streets. She had Albert McVicker's watch in her purse. This detail continues to speak. Why keep it? Why carry, through all the careful planning and the clean departure, this one small physical object that connected her to the dead man? It could not have been practical. A watch was evidence, was a link, was exactly the kind of thing she should have left behind or destroyed. But she kept it. Perhaps it was simply habit, the accumulation of ordinary object-keeping that is so embedded in daily life that it bypasses conscious decision. Perhaps it was something more deliberate, a keeping, a possession that meant something she wasn't ready to analyze. Perhaps it was an act she didn't know she was performing, the holding of something that had been his, as a kind of stay against the full weight of what she had done. Or perhaps it was simply a mistake. Perhaps, in the haste and the focus of those final hours in Stockton, she simply forgot to take it out of her bag and leave it behind. We cannot know. The watch is gone, consumed into the evidence record and eventually dispersed. But the act of carrying it, the choice or the oversight or the something in between, persists in the historical account as one of the most humanizing details in Emma's story. It makes her, for a moment, something other than the trunk murderess of the headlines. It makes her a woman who carried something she could not let go of. A woman who was connected, in some small and private way, to the man she had killed. A woman for whom murder was, perhaps, not the clean and cold transaction that the rest of her behavior might suggest. There is grief in that watch, or something that functions like grief. And grief, even in the most terrible circumstances, is a human thing. Let us spend a moment with the city of Stockton, not the 1906 Stockton of the crime, but the Stockton of today. Because place matters. Because the geography of a story persists long after the people in it are gone. The ground where things happened remains, even when the buildings are replaced and the streets are renamed, and the city grows in ways no one in 1906 could have predicted. Stockton today is a city of nearly 300,000 people. It is diverse, demographically complex, shaped by the same agricultural economy that defined it in 1906, but also by a century of immigration and industrial change, and the particular dynamics of California's Central Valley, which has its own stories and its own complications entirely separate from the Emma Ledoux case. It is a city with real problems and real vitality and the full, contradictory texture of any American city that has been continuously inhabited for over a century. And somewhere in that city, in a museum, or in the records of a local historical society, or in the accumulated memory of the people who know their city's history, the story of the trunk in the depot is still alive. It is one of Stockton's most famous and most disturbing historical episodes. Local historians know it. Visitors to the museum see the trunk, or a piece of it, or the documentation of what it once held. The story persists because stories about terrible things that happened here, in this specific place, tend to persist, embedded in the local consciousness as both a warning and a source of the dark fascination that genuine historical tragedy generates. The hotel where Emma and Albert McVicker stayed is gone. The depot as it existed in 1906 is gone, replaced by later structures and eventually by the modern infrastructure of a city that has been rebuilt and rebuilt again over the century since Emma's crime. The specific geography of those days, the route Emma walked to the hardware store, the street where the trunk merchant delivered his merchandise, the corridor of the hotel where the staff saw Emma passing calmly, has been overlaid by so many subsequent years of ordinary life that it is no longer easily traceable on the physical map. But the story maps onto the city regardless. Because stories, once they attach to a place, do not leave simply because the physical markers change. The hotel is gone, but the address is still there. The depot has been rebuilt, but the location is still there. And the people who know what happened on those streets in those days carry a kind of presence, a sense of the layered reality of place, that the physical changes cannot entirely erase. This is one of the things about true crime as a practice that, at its best, accomplishes something real. It makes us aware of the layered reality of the world we move through. Every place has its history. Every street has things that happened on it that we cannot see, but that shaped what the street is today. Every building that stands where another building once stood contains, in some sense, the shadow of what preceded it. We live in a world that is dense with the residue of what happened before us, and true crime. The careful, honest examination of specific terrible events in specific real places is one of the ways we can become aware of that density. Emma Ledoux made Stockton a place with a particular weight in its history. She made the Stockton Depot, for a brief period in 1906, the most discussed location in California. She made the spring of that year, those particular weeks of March and April, before the earthquake changed everything, into a moment that the state's consciousness would hold differently because of what happened there. She also, of course, made Albert McVicker's life into something it would not have otherwise been. She made his name known, not for anything he achieved or any contribution he made, but for the manner of his death. This is one of the cruelest dimensions of the harm that murder inflicts. It redefines the victim. It makes their death their primary identity, overshadowing the life they actually lived. Albert McVicker was a man for 40 years before he became a body in a trunk. He had a history, an accumulation of experiences and relationships and choices in ordinary days that existed entirely independent of the manner of his death. But the manner of his death is what made him known, and the manner of his death is what remains attached to his name. This is why we have tried, throughout this telling, to keep returning to Albert McVicker as a person, to remember that he was 40 years old and working and hopeful and in love with a woman who would kill him. To remember that his love, however misplaced, was genuine. To remember that he traveled to Stockton in good faith, believing in a reconciliation that was never going to happen, and was met with a kindness that was entirely performed and a drink that was poisoned. He deserved a full life. He deserved the chance to find out, the hard way if necessary, that Emma Ledoux was not the person he believed her to be, but to find that out while still alive, while still capable of walking away and building something different. He deserved the ordinary hard lesson of misplaced love, not the permanent lesson of betrayal that leads to death. He didn't get to have that. He got the Stockton Hotel and the whiskey and the trunk and the newspaper headlines and the museum artifact. He got the historical footnote, the name in the record, the occasional mention in the accounts of Emma's story as the victim. He was more than the victim. He was a person. His name was Albert McVicker, and he deserves to be said, plainly and with intention, in whatever spaces his story is told. Albert McVicker, 40 years old, Stockton, California, March 23, 1906. Remembered. Now let us move, carefully and with intention, toward the closing dimensions of this story. We have covered the major elements: the crime, the trial, the imprisonment, the cultural aftermath, the unanswered questions. What remains is to gather and reflect, to bring together the threads we have followed through this long night and hold them in the light of whatever understanding is available to us. And then, gently, to let the story settle, to let it find its place in whatever space you have made for it as you listened, to let it be what it is, complete and incomplete, answered and unanswerable, historical and present in the way that true stories about real people are always present, carrying in their telling the weight of lives that actually happened and cannot be unlived or undone. Take a long breath. Let your body remember it is in a comfortable place, in a safe moment, far from Stockton and 1906 and all of it. You are here. You are safe. The story is a story, and it is almost told. The questions that Emma Ledoux's story leaves behind are not merely historical. They extend, if we follow them carefully, into our own time, into the world of 2026, into the ongoing arguments about women and justice and crime and punishment and the social conditions that produce violence. These questions have not been resolved in the century since Emma died. They have been reformulated, contested, partially answered, and persistently renewed in each generation's encounter with the realities of human harm. What does it mean to punish a person for a crime? What is punishment for? Is it retribution, the application of suffering in proportion to the suffering caused? Is it deterrence, the sending of a message to others who might consider similar acts? Is it incapacitation, the physical removal of a dangerous person from the population they might harm? Is it rehabilitation, the transformation of the person who committed the harm into someone who will not do so again? Emma's 35 years in prison were all of these things to different degrees at different times, and none of them completely. The retributive dimension was clear. A life was taken, and the person who took it spent the better part of her own life in confinement. The deterrent effect, if any, was diffused into the broader cultural awareness of the case. The incapacitation was real and sustained, though whether Emma, had she been released earlier and under different circumstances, would have harmed anyone else is unknowable. The rehabilitative dimension is the hardest to assess, because we have so little access to Emma's interior life during those decades of confinement. Did she change? Did the years in prison produce in Emma Ledoux any genuine shift in the way she thought about other people, about their rights, about her own capacity for harm? Or did she remain, at her core, the same person who had stood in that hotel room in Stockton, adaptable, self-contained, fundamentally oriented toward her own survival at the expense of others when necessary? We cannot answer this with any confidence. The official record tells us she was a cooperative prisoner. It does not tell us anything meaningful about her internal state. The few fragments of correspondence that survive give us little more than the practical surface of her life in confinement. We do not have the diary of Emma Ledoux, the memoir, the long reflective letter to a trusted correspondent in which she worked through the meaning of her choices and their consequences. We have the absence of those things, the silence where her inner life would have been if she had chosen to document it, and if those documents had survived. This silence is itself significant. It is the silence of a woman who learned, early and thoroughly, that the inside of her own mind was the one space where she was truly private, truly free, truly herself rather than the version of herself that was useful in a given moment. After decades of performing for audiences, for husbands and doctors and hotel clerks and judges and juries and prison officials, Emma's interior life was hers alone. She did not share it with the historical record, and the historical record, consequently, cannot give it to us. What we can do is think about what her silence might mean, not as evasion, but as privacy, as the assertion of a self that refused to be entirely consumed by the public narrative of her crime. Emma Ledoux, whatever else she was a person who understood the difference between what other people could see and what they could not. She had been managing that difference her entire adult life. In prison, stripped of almost every other form of agency, that management of the visible and invisible self may have been one of the few forms of control still available to her. She held it. She kept it. She took it with her when she died. There is something in that is very human. Not admirable, necessarily. Not redemptive in any obvious sense. But human, the stubborn persistence of interiority, of private selfhood, even in conditions designed to eliminate it. California in 1941, the year Emma died, was a state mobilizing for war. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor was still months away, but the deteriorating international situation was already transforming California's economy and its consciousness. Defense industries were ramping up. The ports were buzzing. The state that Emma had moved through in the gaslit, horse and wagon world of the late 19th century was now a modern industrial state, connected by highways and telephones, and a culture that bore almost no visible resemblance to the world Emma had been born into. She had watched all of this change, at a distance, through the filtered lens of the incarcerated, for 35 years. The automobiles that replaced the horses. The airplanes that replaced the trains as the primary technology of speed and distance. The radio that replaced the telegraph as the nervous system of information transmission. The motion pictures that replaced the printed image as the dominant medium of cultural representation. All of it arriving, year by year, in the newspaper accounts and the reports of visitors, and the changed behavior of the guards and officials who managed her confinement. What Emma made of all this change, whether she found it fascinating or alien, or simply the ongoing background noise of a world she was no longer part of, we cannot say. But she had seen, in a single lifetime, a transformation of the material world so complete that the California of 1941 and the California of 1875 could barely be said to be the same place in any meaningful sense beyond the geography. She had lived through it, and she had lived through it inside, which is its own particular way of living through a century's worth of change. The Emma Ledoux who died in 1941 was not the Emma who had been convicted in 1906. Not in any simple, linear sense of change, but in the accumulative sense that 35 years of any kind of life changes a person, gradually, incompletely, without the dramatic arc of transformation that the redemption narrative would require, but genuinely, in the way that time and experience and the slow grinding of circumstances changes everyone who survives long enough to be changed by them. What she was, in those final years, is difficult to say. Older, quieter, almost certainly, less dynamic, less dangerous in the active sense. A woman who had been in prison so long that the prison had become the world, not a comfortable world, not a chosen world, but the world nonetheless, the only one available. The one she woke up in every morning and went to sleep in every night. She died. The record notes it with the administrative brevity of all institutional deaths, the date, the cause, the disposition of the remains. The newspapers, which had devoted so many column inches to her arrest and trial and conviction, managed a few brief paragraphs. The trunk murderess was dead at 66. The California Institution for Women, where she spent her final years, recorded her passing, and moved on to the management of the living. And Emma Ledoux, who had been so vivid, so present, so incandescently there in the public consciousness of 1906 California, became, finally, a historical figure, receding, settling, moving from the recent past into the more general past, and eventually into the specifically historical past that requires footnotes and research and the patient recovery of things that time has half buried. Until tonight, when we have spent several hours in her company, moving through her life, her crime, her trial, her long incarceration, her death and its aftermath, trying to understand something true about her and about the world she moved through and about ourselves. As people who find these stories compelling in the specific hours of the night, when the ordinary defenses are down and something more honest than the daylight self is available. We are almost at the end now, but there is one more thing to say before we get there. The story of Emma Ledoux, told as it has been told traditionally, the trunk murderess, the Black Widow, the woman whose beauty and cunning made her more dangerous than men, is a story designed to produce a specific response. It is designed to produce fear and disgust, and the comfortable certainty that the person at the center of it is other, fundamentally, inalienably different from the person listening or reading. It is designed to make Emma a monster, because monsters are safe. You can be horrified by a monster and then go back to your ordinary life without any of the horror attaching itself to anything real. The story we have tried to tell tonight is different. It is not safer. In fact, it is less safe, because it asks you to sit with the discomfort of recognizing Emma's humanity rather than dismissing it. It asks you to hold in your mind, simultaneously, the fact that she committed a terrible act and the fact that she was a human being shaped by real circumstances in a real world. It asks you to understand that these two things are not contradictory, that people can be both damaged and dangerous, both understandable and culpable, both fully human and capable of terrible harm. This is not a comfortable story to hold. It is not designed to let you go to sleep without being changed. It is designed, as the best true crime stories are designed, to leave something in you that was not there before, something that thinks differently about the world, something that carries the weight of Albert McVicker's name and Emma's 35 years in prison and the trunk in the museum with a little more care than you carried them before. That is what we hope for. Not shock, not entertainment, not the pleasurable shudder of horror that fades when you turn off the light. Something more lasting, something real. Before we arrive at the final closing of this story, there are a few threads worth picking up one more time. Threads we have followed but not fully completed, details that deserve a second examination in the light of everything we have established. The first is the matter of Emma's paroles, which we have mentioned but not fully explored. Emma Ledoux was paroled and returned to prison multiple times over the decades of her sentence. This pattern, release, violation, return, is worth dwelling on not just because of what it tells us about Emma, but because of what it tells us about the parole system and about the conditions that were attached to a woman like Emma's release into the world. Parole in the early 20th century was, even more than it is today, a conditional and paternalistic system. The conditions attached to a parolee's release were extensive and often arbitrary. Geographic restrictions, behavioral requirements, reporting obligations, restrictions on association that could encompass wide categories of people and activities. For Emma, who had spent her adult life operating in the informal economies and transient communities of the American West, many of these conditions were probably direct conflicts with the modes of life she knew how to live. A woman who had spent decades learning to survive by moving, adapting, and managing multiple simultaneous identities was not well suited to a parole system that required stability, transparency, and consistent compliance with fixed rules. The conditions of her parole were probably designed with a different kind of released prisoner in mind, someone who had a stable home, a fixed community, family, or community ties that would provide structure and support. Emma, who had burned most of those bridges in the years before her conviction, was being released into a world that she no longer had the social infrastructure to navigate in the way the system required. This is not an exculpation of the violations. Whatever she did that sent her back each time was her choice. But it is a context, the context of a system that was not designed to succeed with people like Emma, releasing them into conditions that were almost designed to fail. There is also the matter of Eugene Ledoux, the husband whose name Emma had carried into infamy, and who has been, throughout this telling, a somewhat shadowy figure. We know he existed. We know he married Emma in 1905 without knowing she was already married. We know his name appeared in the newspapers in connection with the case. Beyond that, the record thins to almost nothing. But Eugene Ledoux's experience is worth a moment of genuine attention. He was deceived, completely and persistently, by a woman he had chosen as a life partner. He had built whatever expectations and hopes attached to marriage on a foundation that turned out to be fabricated. And then he had watched, from the public distance of newspaper coverage and court proceedings, as that fabrication was dismantled and the real shape of his wife's life was revealed. The revelation would have been multi-layered and devastating. Not only had he married a woman who already had a husband, not only was that woman now accused and then convicted of killing that husband, but the manner of the killing, the morphine, the trunk, the cold practicality of it, would have told him something about the person he had been intimate with that was deeply, perhaps irrecoverably, destabilizing. Had Emma looked at him with the same eyes that had looked at Albert McVicker? Had their marriage been, from her perspective, the same kind of managed performance? Was he, like McVicker, a problem she was managing? Could he have been, under different circumstances, the one in the trunk? These questions would have been impossible not to ask, and the asking of them would have made the ordinary texture of his life, the memories of their time together, the moments of apparent connection and intimacy, into something suspect, something that could not be trusted, something that might have been entirely illusory from the beginning. This kind of retroactive distrust, the undermining of memory by the revelation of deception, is one of the less discussed forms of harm that fraud and manipulation cause. It is not the primary harm. It is not as severe as the harm done to Albert McVicker, but it is real, and it endures in the life of the deceived person long after the deceiver has been removed from their daily experience. Eugene Ledoux carried whatever the revelation of Emma's true nature did to his understanding of himself and his judgment and his capacity for trust into the rest of his life. We do not know how much was left of him at the end of it, in the parts that mattered most. There is also the question of Emma's biological family, the family she was born into in Amador County, the parents and any siblings who raised her and watched her become whoever she became. The records are sparse here too, but there are fragments suggesting that Emma maintained some contact with family members even after her conviction, that there were visits, correspondence, the fragile continuation of family bonds even across the dramatic rupture of what she had done. Family members of people convicted of serious crimes occupy a particularly painful position. They did not commit the crime. They have no legal responsibility for it, but they carry the social and emotional weight of the association, the scrutiny, the questions, the need to process their own grief and horror and perhaps shame while managing the external world's response to a name that has become notorious. Emma's family was from a respectable community in Amador County. The embarrassment and pain of having their name attached to the Trunk murderous trial would have been real and lasting. And yet family is family. The bonds that form in childhood, in the shared space of daily life and domestic intimacy, do not dissolve simply because a family member has done something terrible. They persist, complicated by the terrible thing, shaped by it, sometimes broken by it, but not always. The visits that apparently occurred during Emma's incarceration suggest that some member or members of her family maintained a relationship with her through the decades, maintained some version of connection that acknowledged both the horror of what she had done and the earlier, different, more ordinary Emma who had existed before it. This, too, is worth holding. The families of people who commit terrible acts are themselves victims of a kind, shaped by the crime, damaged by the publicity, burdened by the association, and they rarely appear in the stories that crime generates. They are the invisible collateral of public notoriety, and they deserve acknowledgement even if they do not receive much. One more detail that deserves examination is the matter of Emma's mental state. Not in the clinical, diagnostic sense that would have been available to the very limited psychology of 1906, but in the broader sense of what kind of person Emma was and what, if anything, in her psychological structure made the choices she made comprehensible in a way that goes beyond simple moral failure. Modern psychology offers some frameworks that are potentially applicable to Emma's story, though applying them across a century of time and to a person whose inner life is so incompletely documented is necessarily speculative. The pattern of behavior that Emma demonstrated, the multiple simultaneous identities, the instrumental use of relationships, the apparent absence of the kind of emotional break that prevents most people from crossing certain lines, the facility with deception, the capacity for composed and functional behavior in the immediate aftermath of causing someone's death. These are qualities that psychologists today would likely examine in some detail. Whether Emma Ledoux would have received a clinical diagnosis that explained or partially accounted for those qualities, had the psychological tools been available and applied in 1906, is unknowable. What we can say is that the qualities she demonstrated are not random. They are coherent, they form a recognizable pattern, and that pattern has been documented in other people in other contexts across the history of clinical psychology. The specific combination of factors that produces a person capable of what Emma did is not fully understood even today. In the 19th century world she grew up in had no framework for understanding it at all. The world she grew up in explained people like Emma in moral terms. She was bad. She was wicked. She was a woman who had chosen to do wrong, repeatedly and deliberately, because she lacked the moral fiber to do otherwise. This was the framework that the legal system applied to her, that the newspapers applied to her, that the community around her applied to her. It was not wrong. Exactly. The moral responsibility for her choices was genuinely hers, and the legal system's response was not unjust in its basic structure. But it was incomplete. Moral framing alone cannot fully explain the specific qualities that Emma demonstrated, cannot account for why she was the way she was, cannot give us any purchase on the question of what might have produced a different outcome under different conditions. That question, what might have produced a different outcome, is perhaps the most practically important question that emerges from any serious examination of a case like this one, because the answer to it is not academic. It has implications for how we raise children, how we construct communities, how we provide support to people who are struggling, how we identify and respond to people who are moving down paths that lead to harm. If Emma Ledoux's story tells us anything useful about the prevention of future harm, it is this: the making of dangerous people is not a mystery. It is a process, and the process is shaped at every stage by the world around the person, by the opportunities available to them, the support given or withheld, the damage done and not repaired, the small choices and the large ones that accumulate into the shape of a life. We cannot go back and change Emma's world. We cannot give her the options she didn't have, the support she didn't receive, the pathways she never found. She is gone, and the world that made her is gone, and what remains is the story and the questions and the very small hope that understanding can be, over time and across generations, a hedge against repetition. That is what we take from the story of Emma Ledoux, finally. Not the shock, not the horror, not the comfortable othering of a woman whose capacity for harm we can safely declare incomprehensible and move on. What we take is the understanding, difficult, incomplete, necessary, that the distance between ordinary and dangerous is not as large as we would like it to be, and that the making of that distance larger for the people who come after us is worth whatever effort it requires. We are almost done now. One more breath. One more moment of settling. We have been traveling a long road tonight. From the beginning of this story, the trunk, the smell, the terrible discovery in the Stockton Depot, to the end, or as close to an end as true stories ever really have. We have been in the company of people who lived and loved and suffered and died 120 years ago, in a California that we can reconstruct only imperfectly from the records that time has left us. Let me do something now that I don't always have the opportunity to do in these tellings, which is to sit with you directly for a moment. Not through the story, not through the characters, but simply as a voice in the dark, speaking to you wherever you are. You have been listening for a long time. If you started from the beginning and you're still here, you have given this story a serious portion of your evening, and I am genuinely grateful for that. Not in a performative way, genuinely. The stories we tell here are told with care because the people they are about, the victims especially, but also the perpetrators, who are human beings too, deserve to be treated with care. And the people who listen to them, who choose to spend their quiet hours with these difficult histories, deserve a narrator who takes that choice seriously. If you have been drifting in and out of sleep as you listened, that is exactly what this space is for. The story will be here. The details will return to you in fragments as you wake and rest and wake again. Some of it will stay with you, and some of it will dissolve into the undifferentiated warmth of a night while spent in the company of a voice that meant you no harm. If you are still awake, if the story has kept you here despite the late hour and the comfortable bed, I understand that too. Some stories don't let go easily. Some stories have a grip that the comfortable darkness can't quite loosen, that the weight of the blanket and the softness of the pillow can't quite compete with. The story of Emma Ledoux is that kind of story. It has edges that catch on things. Before we finish, before I give you the quiet close that you have been moving toward, I want to ask you to do something simple. Leave a comment. Tell us where you are in the world. Tell us what time it is. Tell us whether the story reached you, whether it moved you, whether it made you think about something you hadn't thought about before. These comments are, genuinely, the way we know you are there. The way the people who make this content understand that the work is reaching the people it is intended for. And if you haven't yet subscribed to this channel, please do that now. Not because of algorithms or metrics, though those matter too, but because subscribing is a way of saying, I found something worth returning to here. I want more of this. I want to come back to this space again on other nights, when the day has been long and the quiet seems very far away and a gentle voice with a careful story is exactly what I need. That is what this channel is for. That is what we are here to do. And your subscription is what makes it possible. Now, let us finish the story of Emma Ledoux. She was born Emma Teresa Cole in Amador County, California, in 1875. She was a girl who wanted more than the world she had been given. She moved through the world with great intelligence and considerable determination, using the tools available to her, her appearance, her adaptability, her capacity for performance, to survive and sometimes to thrive in conditions that offered women of her background very limited options. She made choices that were understandable in the context of her life and times, even when those choices were dishonest. She made choices that were harder to understand and impossible to excuse, culminating in the death of a man who loved her and trusted her and deserved better from her than she gave him. She was caught. She was tried. She was convicted. She spent 35 years in the custody of the state that had been both the landscape of her freedom and the instrument of her punishment. She died in 1941, old and quiet, in a world so changed from the one she had been born into that it might have belonged to a different species entirely. She died without a public final statement, without the dramatic closure that stories about criminals are supposed to have. She simply stopped. And Albert McVicker, Albert N. McVicker, 40 years old, a working man who had traveled to Stockton in hope and died there in betrayal, remained what he had always been, the person at the center of this story, the person whose death caused everything that followed, the person whose life deserves to be named in every telling of the story that bears the name of the woman who ended it. His name was Albert McVicker. He is remembered here tonight. The trunk that held his body is still in a museum in California. It has been there for over a century. It will probably be there for another century, because objects with that kind of specific, documented history are not discarded. They are too useful as anchors for the stories that need physical form to remain present in the world. If you ever find yourself in that museum, standing in front of that trunk, take a moment to be still, to let what it represents settle into you. Not the horror, not the specific terrible vision of what was inside it, but the weight, the simple, undeniable weight of a thing that was present at a death and has outlasted everyone involved. The way that ordinary objects can become, through their association with extraordinary events, objects of a kind of mute testimony. They cannot speak, but they insist on their presence. And that insistence is a form of memory that complements and sometimes outlasts the kind of memory that requires words. We have been telling this story in words tonight, a great many words. Across the long hours of the night, we have followed Emma Ledoux from her birth in Amador County to her death in a California prison. We have met Albert McVicker and mourned him. We have sat with the investigators and the witnesses and the jurors and the judges who processed this story through the formal machinery of justice. We have thought about the world that produced Emma and the world that responded to what she did and the world that continues to hold her story as a piece of its own history. And now we are done. Or as done as this kind of story ever gets. Because true stories don't end the way fiction ends. They don't resolve into clean conclusions with all threads gathered and all questions answered and all the meaning neatly packaged for the reader's satisfaction. They end because the narrator stops, because the available material has been covered, because the night is long and rest is needed, because the story has been told as fully as this moment allows. What you do with it, what you carry from it, what questions it leaves in you, what you think about when you wake up tomorrow, and this story is still somewhere in the back of your mind. That is yours. I cannot give you a conclusion that closes it down. I can only give you the story as honestly and as carefully as I can tell it, and trust that you will do something real with it. The sky is probably still dark where you are, if you have been with this story through the night. Or perhaps the first light is beginning, the imperceptible graying of the horizon that precedes dawn. Either way, the world is still out there, the ordinary world with its ordinary demands and its ordinary beauties, waiting for you to return to it after this long excursion into the past. Sleep, if you haven't already. Rest, if you can. Take the story with you into whatever sleep you find, and let it work its way into whatever understanding it needs to become. And tomorrow, or tonight, or whenever you find this channel again, there will be another story. Another set of real people in a real place at a real moment in history, whose lives deserve the same careful attention, the same honest treatment, the same slow and respectful telling that we have tried to give Emma Ledoux and Albert McVicker tonight. We will be here for it. We hope you will be too. And now, in this final passage, let us do what true crime done well always does at its best. Return to the human. Return to the place before the crime, and after the crime, and outside the crime, where the ordinary world continues to exist regardless of the terrible things that punctuate it. The California of 2026 is not the California of 1906. The distances are different. The connections are different. The speed of information, the texture of daily life, the social and legal frameworks within which people move, all different in ways that would have been incomprehensible to the people whose story we have spent this night telling. And yet something persists across that distance. Something endures. People still want more than they have. People still find themselves in situations where the available options all seem inadequate. People still love badly and trust wrongly and make choices that they cannot undo. People still carry secrets they are afraid to let out, and sometimes those secrets grow heavy enough to do terrible things to the people who carry them and to the people around them. This is not a pessimistic observation. It is simply an honest one. Human nature is not infinitely malleable. The qualities that made Emma Ledoux capable of what she did, and the qualities that made Albert McVicker capable of the love that brought him to Stockton. These are qualities that persist in the human population across centuries and cultural changes. We are still recognizably the same species that inhabited the California of 1906, still driven by the same fundamental desires and fears, still navigating the same basic tensions between what we want and what we can honestly obtain. What changes is the world around those qualities. The social structures, the available options, the legal frameworks, the presence or absence of support systems that can absorb the pressure before it becomes catastrophic, the education and the resources and the dignity that determine whether a person's intelligence and energy go toward building something or toward destroying it. Emma Ledoux, in a world that offered her more economic independence, more social mobility, more legitimate paths to the security and agency she sought, might not have become the trunk murderess. Or she might have. We can't run the counterfactual. But the question is worth asking, because it reminds us that the conditions we create for the people around us are not neutral. They are causal. They produce outcomes. And the outcomes include, in the lives of real people, both the flourishing and the damage that are always simultaneously present in any human community. This is not a comfortable thought, and it is not designed to be. The comfortable thought is that terrible people do terrible things, and good systems catch them, and justice is served, and everyone else is safe. The uncomfortable thought is that terrible things are produced, in part, by conditions that all of us participate in creating and maintaining, and that the responsibility for those conditions is distributed more broadly than the legal system's focus on individual perpetrators can ever fully acknowledge. We hold both of these things. The individual responsibility, Emma's, real and undeniable, and the distributed responsibility, the world's, diffuse and harder to pin down, but equally real. Tonight, that is the note we close on. Not resolution, not comfort, but the honest, balanced, genuinely thoughtful place where understanding lives, in the tension between individual and structural, between personal and social, between the specific story of Emma Ledoux and the broader story of a world that made her and broke her and continues to make and break people in different ways, but with recognizable patterns. Albert McVicker deserved to live. He deserved a long, ordinary life, full of the unremarkable days that ordinary long lives are mostly made of. He did not get it. And the people who loved him, the people whose names we don't know, the friends and family members and colleagues whose grief was real and private and never made it into the historical record, lived with that loss in the way that all losses of sudden, violent death are lived with, incompletely, persistently, with the particular weight of a death that should not have happened and therefore cannot be fully absorbed. We honor them too, tonight. The unnamed grievers. The people outside the frame of the story who were in it regardless. And we honor the effort, always the effort, to understand, to look honestly at the difficult things, to resist the easy explanation and the satisfying closure and the comfortable monster in favor of the more demanding truth that what happens in the world, good and bad, is produced by all of us together, in the ways we organize our societies and raise our children and treat the people around us when they are struggling. Emma Ledoux was born in 1875 and died in 1941. She lived 66 years, most of them in ways that history would not have thought worth recording, a few of them in ways that history could not stop recording. She was a daughter and a wife and a widow and a prisoner and a name in the newspaper and a woman who sat in a cell for 35 years and held her interior life close. She was the person who killed Albert McVicker, and she was more than that person, and both of those things are true simultaneously. Albert McVicker was born, we don't know exactly when, and died on the night of March 23, 1906, in a hotel room in Stockton, California. He was 40 years old. He had loved a woman who could not afford to love him back. He had traveled in hope and been met with calculation. His body had been placed in a trunk that sat in a railroad depot for the better part of a day, found by workers who were doing their ordinary jobs, opened by officers who were doing their ordinary jobs, and set in motion the long chain of legal and social events that we have been following all night. He deserved better. He got the trunk and the museum and the historical footnote in this story. It is not enough, but it is what is available. His name was Albert McVicker. Say it, if you will, in whatever private space you occupy tonight. Just say his name. It is the smallest possible honoring, and it is real. Albert McVicker. We are done now with the formal telling of this story. The night is as long as it needs to be, and you have been with it patiently, wherever you are and whatever time it is in your corner of the world. The lights are low. The blanket is warm. The voice in your ear has done what it set out to do, carried you through 120 years of history with as much honesty and care as it could manage. Now it is time to rest. Let the story settle into the background of your mind, the way stories settle when they have been fully told. Let it become one of the things you know, not something you need to hold actively, not something you need to process or analyze any further tonight, but something that is simply there, available, part of the expanded picture of the world that listening to a story carefully always produces. You know more tonight than you did when we started. About Emma Ledoux, about Albert McVicker, about the California of 1906 and the lives lived in it and the choices made within it. About the questions that true stories leave behind, which are always more interesting and more important than the answers they contain. That knowing is yours. Carry it gently. If you have been here all night and you are still awake, truly still awake, not half dreaming, leave a comment before you close your eyes. Tell me what stayed with you. Tell me what you're thinking about. Tell me where you are and what time it is, and whether the voice found you in whatever hour you needed it. I read every comment. The people behind this channel read every comment. You are not shouting into the void. You are in a conversation, quiet, asynchronous, spread across time zones and languages, and the great distances that separate human beings from each other, with other people who chose to spend their dark hours in the company of difficult stories told with care. That is something worth being part of. Please like this video if the story gave you something real tonight. Please subscribe to the channel if you want to return. There are more stories here. Other lives, other crimes, other nights of patient, careful telling. And each one is waiting for you when you are ready. For now, though, for this moment, close your eyes. The story is told. Albert McVicker's name has been said in the world tonight. and it will persist a little longer in the memories of the people who heard it. The trunk is in its museum. Emma Ledoux has been as fully understood as she can be across this distance by people who were not there and cannot know everything and have tried to see truly anyway. The night is quiet. You are safe. Sleep now, wherever you are. We will be here when you need us again. Good night.